There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives after everything is done. The lights are low. The phone is face down. The day has officially ended, and yet something follows you under the covers. Not a memory, exactly. Not a specific worry, though those are there too. Something harder to name. A residue. A low hum. A sense that the mind, despite being given permission to rest, has not yet agreed to stop. You are not the only one who knows this feeling. The person lying awake in the next room knows it. The man in his 50s who has done everything right today still knows it. The woman who is exhausted in every cell of her body and somehow cannot sleep knows it. Carl Jung would have recognized this immediately. He spent decades asking a question that most people find too uncomfortable to sit with. What does the mind do when we are not watching it? His answer was not reassuring in the short term, but it was, in its way, deeply kind. He believed that the mind does not shut down at night. It processes, it sorts, it surfaces. And if you have spent the day running from certain feelings, avoiding certain truths, performing certain versions of yourself that don't quite fit, the night will bring them back, not as punishment, as completion. And that is where we begin tonight. There is something worth understanding about why the night mind gets loud. It is not about weakness. It is not about anxiety as a flaw. It is about 10 very ordinary habits, habits that seem harmless in daylight, that accumulate quietly across the hours and arrive at your pillow as restlessness. Tonight, we are going to sit with all 10 of them. Not to fix them immediately, not to add another item to your mental to-do list, but to understand them the way Jung understood everything, from the inside out. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. That sentence may already feel familiar. We are going to understand exactly what it means before this night is over. For now, let your body settle. Let your shoulders drop slightly. You do not have to do anything with what you hear tonight except let it in. Jung once described the unconscious as a vast country that exists just beneath the surface of everything you think you are. Most of us live on the surface. We handle what is visible, we manage what is demanded. And at the end of the day, we climb into bed and wonder why the country below will not be still. The answer, as he saw it, begins not in the night, but in the day. What follows you into the dark is what you carried through the light. And so we begin. Let the breath slow a little. The story we are entering tonight has been waiting for you. Not because something is wrong, but because something in you has been patient, has been watching, has been ready for a long time to be heard. That is the first thing to understand about the Jungian night. It is not hostile, it is honest. And honesty, when we have been avoiding it, can feel loud. By the time we reach the end of this conversation, you will recognize the 10 habits clearly. Not with shame, because shame closes doors, but with the quiet recognition that comes when something finally makes sense. Picture this for a moment. A man, let us say he is 53. though this is not specifically about age, lies in the dark. The day was not bad. Nothing dramatic occurred. The work got done. Dinner was shared. The calls were returned. And yet here he is at 11:45, looking at the ceiling with a mind that has not agreed to stop. He does not know what he is thinking about exactly. The thoughts move too quickly and too randomly to be tracked. The project at work flickers past. Then a conversation from 3 days ago. Then something he saw on his phone before bed, though he could not say what precisely. Then a faint, unlocatable feeling he has had all day but never stopped to examine. He closes his eyes. The thoughts do not stop. He opens them again. He is not anxious. Exactly. He is not depressed. He is simply, and this is the word he cannot quite find, unsettled. What he is experiencing is not insomnia in the medical sense. It is something quieter and more ordinary than that. It is the nightly conversation his psyche is trying to have with him through the only channel available when the day's noise has finally stopped. Tonight, we are going to learn to hear that conversation. Not to solve it, not to manage it, to hear it. And hearing it, Jung believed, is already the beginning of something that matters. Jung believed that what we refuse to see in ourselves does not disappear. It goes underground. And it speaks to us at night in a language we have not yet learned to translate. Tonight, we learn a little of that language, and somewhere along the way, without any effort, the night will begin to soften. Chapter 2, The Mind That Never Powers Down Imagine a River. During the day, the surface is in constant motion. Boats crossing, wind disturbing the water, light bouncing off every ripple. You can barely see below. But at night, when everything stills, the river becomes transparent. You see what has always been there, moving beneath the surface, slowly, steadily, without any attention from you. That is what Jung believed the psyche does each night. The surface noise of the day, the meetings, the decisions, the noise, the performance, all of that settles. And what remains is the river's actual current, the deeper movement, the life beneath the managed life. For most people, this revelation is uncomfortable, because the deeper current carries things we have not attended to. And here is the question worth sitting with. What is in your river tonight? Notice the weight of your body where it rests. The mind that never fully powers down is not broken. It is performing a function that is essential to psychological health. Jung called this the process of individuation, the lifelong work of becoming more fully yourself. The unconscious is always engaged in this work, whether you are awake or asleep. The problem is not that your mind is active at night. The problem is what we feed it during the day. Think of a person you might know. Not anyone specific, just a man in his mid-50s who has spent the last 30 years being useful, being responsible, solving problems before they become problems. He is good at this. People rely on him for it. There is a quiet pride in that reliability. But something he has not done in a long time is simply sit still. Not because he is afraid of stillness exactly, but because the moment he slows down, something surfaces. An unnamed feeling. A question he cannot answer with productivity. A sense that the life he has built, though solid and good in so many ways, has been built partly on the outside and only barely on the inside. When he goes to bed at night, his mind does not power down. It picks up where the day left off, not the tasks, but the question the tasks were helping him avoid. That is the mind that never powers down. Not a malfunction, a conversation waiting to be had. Jung saw this pattern in patient after patient. The executive who could run a company but could not name what he felt. The mother who could manage a household with extraordinary competence and came to therapy exhausted by a life that looked exactly right from the outside. The retired professional who had achieved everything he had set out to achieve and woke at 3 a.m. with an emptiness he could not explain. The mind never powers down because the self is still speaking. And the self, the deeper self, the one Jung called the true center of the psyche, is patient. It will wait through decades of busyness if it needs to. But at night, when the noise falls away, it tries again. Here is what Jung observed. The modern world has made us extraordinarily skilled at the outer life. We know how to perform, produce, connect, achieve what we have lost, slowly and without noticing, is fluency in the inner life. And the inner life does not disappear because you are fluent in the outer one. It waits. There is something worth holding lightly before we continue. The habits we will explore tonight are not character flaws. They are the ordinary consequences of living in a world that rewards the outer and ignores the inner. Every one of them is understandable. Every one of them has a reason behind it. And every one of them can be seen more clearly, which is already the beginning of something different. Let the next breath be a little slower. Something in you has been waiting for this conversation. We are going to meet the 10 habits one at a time, not racing through them, not listing them, just sitting with each one long enough to recognize it. Because recognition, not fixing, not changing, just recognizing, is already a form of peace. There is a specific comfort that comes with understanding this. If the habits are not character flaws but ordinary consequences, then the 10 hurts we are going to examine are not evidence of your failure. They are evidence of your participation in a world that has, largely, made it very easy to live outward and very difficult to live inward. That is not your fault. It is the water you have been swimming in. Jung observed that even his own patients, educated, thoughtful, self-aware people arrived in his consulting room surprised by the depths of their own interior world. Not because they were incurious, because the culture had provided them with no map for the inward territory and no language for what they encountered there. He spent his career creating that map, and what he found in patient after patient and in his own extensive self-examination was consistent and, in its way, deeply reassuring. The inner self is not a threat, it is a resource. The unconscious is not a dungeon of repressed horror. It is, in the fullest sense, a country. Vast, complex, sometimes surprising, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately the place where the most vital and authentic versions of yourself live. The journey inward does not take you away from your life. It takes you deeper into it. And that journey begins not in a therapist's office, not with a formal practice, but in exactly the kind of quiet you are sitting in tonight. The mind that never powers down is inviting you to begin, not because it is keeping you awake deliberately, but because it has been patient long. Enough. Chapter 3, Too Much Noise, Too Little Silence. Jung made a quiet distinction that most people miss. He did not say the unconscious was mysterious. He said we had stopped paying attention to it. There is a difference. Mystery implies something unknowable. Inattention implies something recoverable. The noise we surround ourselves with, the constant audio, the alerts, the commentary, the background television, the podcasts playing while we drive and the music while we cook, and the notifications arriving every few minutes, all of it is not neutral. It is, in Jungian terms, a kind of psychic insulation. We are keeping something at a distance, and that something is the inner voice, the part of you that knows things you have not yet admitted, the part that notices what you are feeling before you decide what you are supposed to feel. Silence frightens many people precisely because it allows that voice to be heard. There is a study that researchers at the University of Virginia conducted, though the finding has been written about widely since then. They asked participants to sit alone in a room with nothing but their thoughts for 15 minutes. Many found it nearly intolerable. A significant number, when given the option of receiving mild electric shocks rather than continuing to sit in silence, chose the shocks. That is not a small thing. That is a generation of human beings who would rather accept physical discomfort than sit with the contents of their own minds. Jung would not have been surprised. He spent his career studying what happens when the interior life is ignored, and he found the same pattern every time. The more thoroughly we suppress the inner world, the louder it becomes at night. The one time we cannot easily escape it. Let your jaw soften. Think of a Tuesday evening. Nothing dramatic happened today, but you noticed, somewhere around mid-afternoon, a faint restlessness. Not quite sadness, not quite anxiety. Something in between. And so the podcast went on. The television came on. The phone screen filled the space between dinner and sleep, and you arrived at bedtime having processed nothing. The restlessness is still there, unchanged. still waiting. This is what Jung called the accumulated charge of the unconscious. Throughout the day, emotions arrive: frustration, longing, mild grief, quiet joy, a flash of shame, a moment of unexpected beauty. Each one is real. Each one asks for a moment of acknowledgement. When they do not get that acknowledgement, they do not leave. They queue. And at night, when the noise finally stops, they begin to move. The mind that seems to get loud at night is not generating new problems. It is processing the ones that were never allowed to surface during the day. The night does not create the noise. It simply removes the cover. That is the third thing worth understanding. And we will come back to it because it shapes every one of the 10 habits we are going to explore. For now, notice this. You came here tonight. You chose something slow and quiet over something stimulating. That choice is not nothing. That choice is already a small act of courage, the courage of allowing the inner world to have a little space. The silence you are sitting in right now is not empty. It is full of something you have been carrying, and we are going to look at it together. Chapter 4: Constant Stimulation and Psychic Fatigue. There is a concept in Jungian psychology called psychic energy. It is not mystical. Think of it as the fuel that drives attention, feeling, and engagement. We have a certain amount of it available each day. And like any energy source, it can be depleted. What depletes psychic energy fastest? Not hard work, not physical exertion, not even genuine emotional difficulty. What depletes it fastest is constant stimulation that never resolves into meaning, scrolling without purpose, consuming content that neither nourishes nor challenges, hovering in a state of low-level alertness that never fully discharges into action or rest. Jung described a phenomenon he noticed in his patients around the period of industrialization. People were more connected to the outer world than ever before. Newspapers, theaters, social events, the expanding city, and yet many of them arrived in his consulting room feeling hollowed out. Not depressed in the clinical sense, just emptied. He called it a loss of contact with the symbolic life, by which he meant the interior world, the world of image and feeling and intuition, was being crowded out by the exterior one. The modern version of this is not hard to recognize. Picture a man who has been online since 7 in the morning. He has read the news, checked messages, responded to emails, followed a thread on 3 different platforms, watched a short video about something he cannot quite remember now, and arrived at the end of the day with a curious kind of fatigue. He is tired, but his mind is still moving. He tries to sleep and finds the mind has nothing to settle on. It flicks from surface to surface the way it has been trained to do all day. No image holds. No thought completes itself. The scroll has become the mode of being. This is psychic fatigue. Not the fatigue of effort, but the fatigue of overstimulation. The nervous system has been perpetually aroused and never allowed to discharge. And so, at bedtime, it does not know how to stop. There is a specific texture to this kind of tiredness that deserves more than a passing description. You know you are tired. The body signals it clearly enough. Your eyes are heavy, the limbs are reluctant, the thoughts move more slowly or they move chaotically, which is its own kind of slowness. And yet, when the light goes out, the mind begins to accelerate. It is not that the tiredness was not real. It is that the tiredness was physical, while the mind was running on a different fuel altogether, the stale, crackling energy of too much input, too much comparison, too many images that were processed but never integrated. The body rests. The mind continues. And you lie there in the strange position of being exhausted and awake simultaneously. Physicians sometimes call this hyperarousal. The technical term is less important than the experience, which is instantly recognizable to most people who have it. It feels like being behind the wheel of a car where the engine will not idle. The foot is off the accelerator, the brake is applied, the car is stopped. And the engine is still running. Jung's contribution here is not the neurological explanation, but the deeper one. He would say the engine is running because it has unfinished business, not tasks. Something more fundamental. The psyche, denied its daily processing time, is attempting to process at night. It is not misfiring, it is working. And the experience of lying awake with a churning mind is not pathology. It is the sound of a psyche trying to do in the dark what the day would not allow. Understanding that distinction changes the relationship with the sleepless hour. It is not an enemy, it is a request. Let the weight of your body be noticed for a moment. Feel where you are supported. You do not have to do anything. Just notice. Jung's work with the unconscious was rooted in the conviction that the psyche needs what he called interiority, time spent in contact with its own contents, its own images, its own slow processing. Without this, the unconscious begins to intrude into waking life in ways we cannot control. Anxiety that seems disproportionate to the situation, irritability that has no obvious cause, dreams that feel urgent and strange. The 10 habits we are going to explore tonight are all, in different ways, forms of constant stimulation. Some of them are obvious. Some are more subtle. Some are habits you have never thought of as stimulation at all. But they all share a common function. They keep the interior life at a distance. And the interior life, as Jung spent a lifetime showing, does not accept that distance quietly. It will have its say, and the time it chooses, almost without fail, is the time you are finally still. This is not a punishment. It is an invitation. The question is whether you are ready to receive it. By the end of tonight, I think you will be. Chapter 5. The First Hurt endless scrolling. Picture the phone face down on the nightstand. For a moment, nothing happens. The room is quiet. There is the slight adjustment of settling into the mattress, the familiar weight of blankets, the low hum of the house doing what houses do at night. And then, almost automatically, the hand reaches out. The screen lights up. The scroll begins. This gesture is so normalized now that most people do not think of it as a choice. It has become a reflex. The transition from day to sleep is no longer handled by the body and the mind gradually downshifting together. It is interrupted nightly by a device that was engineered to keep your attention as long as possible. Jung never saw a smartphone, but he understood with uncanny accuracy what this kind of stimulation does to the psyche. In his writings on dreams and the unconscious, he described how the mind prepares for sleep. The analytical, effortful mode of daytime consciousness begins to quiet. A different kind of awareness begins to rise, softer, more associative, more connected to image and feeling than to logic and plan. This transitional state, in Jungian terms, is where the night's real work begins. The screen interrupts exactly this transition. When you scroll in the hour before sleep, you are feeding the analytical mind a constant stream of new inputs. Images that require evaluation, headlines that provoke feeling, comparisons that activate the social self. All of it keeps the daytime consciousness firing at exactly the moment it needs to begin releasing. And what gets pushed back is the softer awareness waiting beneath the one that processes the day, the one that integrates emotion with experience, the one that, without this processing time, leaves tomorrow weighted with what today never finished. Let the breath come easily. There is a specific quality to the mind after heavy scrolling. It is a kind of restless fullness, like a stomach that has eaten too much of the wrong thing, not nourished, but full in a way that prevents rest. The mind has consumed dozens of micro-narratives, dozens of images, dozens of emotional flickers, none of them developed into actual experience. And now it sits with all of it, unable to digest. This is what Jung called an unassimilated complex of impressions, which simply means things the psyche received but could not yet process. And they do not wait patiently. They circulate, they surface, they appear as the low-level anxiety of the sleepless hour, the thought patterns that seem to have no source, the images that feel wrong without being identifiable as nightmares. The first hurt is not dramatic. It is not an addiction in the medical sense. It is a habit, a very modern, very ordinary habit. But it is worth seeing clearly because the cost of it is paid every night in the currency of sleep. One study found that the blue light emitted by phone screens suppresses melatonin production for several hours after exposure. The physiological effect alone is significant, but the psychological effect, the overloaded processing channel, the interrupted transition to deeper states is equally real and far less discussed. Here is a small thing worth noticing. On the nights when you do not reach for the phone, something often happens in that quiet space instead. A memory surfaces, a feeling finds a shape, a thought arrives that feels less like noise and more like something real. The mind, given a moment without input, begins doing the work it was waiting to do. That is not nothing. That is the psyche's natural intelligence quietly reasserting itself. The first hurt is endless scrolling. Not because scrolling is evil, but because it borrows time from the one part of the day that belongs entirely to the inner world. And the inner world, night after night, is left waiting. We can begin returning what it is owed, one night at a time. Consider for a moment what it would feel like to give the transition the time it actually needs. You set the phone down, not dramatically, not as a discipline, just set it down, and you lie in the dark. The mind, accustomed to the feed, reaches for the next image. There is none. For a moment, this feels slightly uncomfortable, like the pause after a long piece of music before you are quite sure it has ended. And then something shifts. A thought arrives that is not a reaction to anything external, just a thought that belongs to you. Maybe a memory, small and specific. The smell of a particular season, the face of someone you have not thought of in years. An image from childhood you cannot explain but can somehow feel. These are not generated by an algorithm. They belong to the deep layer of your own personal world. They arrive when given space without being summoned. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the psyche's symbolic life. The capacity to work with its own images rather than only the ones being fed from the outside. The scrolling crowds out this interior image-making. And the interior image-making is not a luxury. It is part of how the psyche metabolizes experience and prepares for genuine rest. The phone face down is not a sacrifice. It is an invitation to the part of you that has been waiting quietly to offer you something. All you have to do is leave enough space for it to arrive. Chapter 6. Why images linger in the unconscious. Jung was fascinated by images, not photographs, not screens. The inner images, the visual language the unconscious uses to communicate with consciousness. Dreams are the most famous example. But Jung understood that the unconscious speaks in images at all hours, not only during sleep. The sudden picture that flashes through your mind when you hear a song from 30 years ago. The way a particular quality of afternoon light can produce an unnamed grief. The image of a door that keeps recurring in moments of uncertainty, though you cannot say which door or why. These are not accidents. In Jung's model, the psyche organizes itself through image, symbol, and story. It is a visual and narrative intelligence, not only a logical one, and this matters when we consider what endless scrolling actually deposits into the psyche. Hundreds of images per session, most of them designed to provoke a response: anger, desire, envy, fear, outrage, amusement. Each image registered by the nervous system, whether consciously processed or not. Each image potentially seeding an emotional association that the unconscious will later attempt to work through. Think of it this way: a gardener who scatters seeds without thinking will face unexpected growth later. The seeds do not disappear because no one consciously planted them. They germinate in their own time, according to their own nature. The images you consume in the hour before sleep, the news that provoked irritation, the comparison that landed with a sting, the conflict you watched play out between strangers online, the advertisement that raised a longing you did not invite, all of them are seeds, and the night is fertile ground. Just notice the air moving in and out. In Jungian terms, images that enter the unconscious do not simply dissolve, they associate. They connect with existing emotional complexes, which are Jung's term for the clusters of feeling and memory organized around a central theme. If you already carry, somewhere beneath the surface, a complex around not being enough, a scrolled image that triggers that feeling will join the cluster. It adds weight to something already present. Across weeks and months of nightly scrolling, the cluster grows. And at bedtime, in the quiet, the cluster speaks. This is not a theoretical concern. It is the lived experience of the nighttime mind for most people who have spent years with screens. The man who cannot identify why he feels vaguely anxious when he tries to sleep may not trace it to the scrolling. He thinks of the anxiety as something that arrives from within, something wrong with him. But often, what he is experiencing is the accumulated weight of thousands of unprocessed images and their associated feelings. Jung once noted that the modern person is in a strange predicament, surrounded by more symbolic material, images, stories, narratives than any generation in history, yet increasingly cut off from the inner life needed to process it. The abundance of external imagery does not enrich the psyche automatically. It depends on what we do with it. And what most of us do with it at bedtime is nothing. We give it to the unconscious, unsorted, and then wonder why the unconscious is restless. Here is the quiet turn in this. The solution is not to never see difficult images, never feel provoked, never consume anything online. That is not the point. The point is the transition, the buffer between the outer world and the inner one, the nightly moment of deceleration that allows the psyche to do its sorting work. When we remove that buffer entirely, when we scroll until the second before the light goes out, we hand the unconscious an unsorted pile of stimulation and expect it to be quiet. It cannot be quiet. It will sort through the night whether we participate or not. The difference is whether we wake feeling restored or wake feeling as if we ran a long road in our sleep. that difference is worth tending. Here is one more layer of this that Jung would have found important. The images that matter to the psyche are not only the disturbing ones. The images of beauty, of meaning, of connection, these are equally significant. They are the symbolic material through which the unconscious communicates its deepest values and desires. The artist who sees a particular quality of evening light and feels something that cannot be put into words is having an experience of the unconscious speaking through image. The older man who catches a glimpse of something in a small child's face and feels briefly the whole weight of time, that is not sentimentality. That is the psyche recognizing something true. These experiences cannot be manufactured through scrolling. They arrive in the spaces between input, in the walk without headphones, in the few minutes of stillness before the phone is reached for, in the transition period we spoke about earlier, the window of no input before sleep, when the day's images settle and the deeper imagery begins to rise. The inner image-making that the psyche needs is not decorative. It is the medium through which the unconscious communicates meaning to consciousness. When it is crowded out by external images designed to provoke reaction rather than invite reflection, the psyche loses a vital channel, and at night, when that channel finally opens, it opens with pressure behind it. Everything that needed to come through but could not gets in line, and the line is long. The solution is not complicated. It is simply giving the inner imagery its time. A small, unoccupied window where the mind can work with its own materials. That is where the real rest lives, not in the absence of thought. In thought that belongs to you. Chapter 7, The Second Hurt. Comparing yourself all day. There is a particular quality of hurt that comparison produces. It is not sharp like physical pain. It is not obvious like grief. It is quiet, and it sneaks in through the back door of ordinary moments. You are having a reasonable morning, and then you see something, a photograph, an achievement, a life that looks like what you once imagined yours might become, and the morning shifts slightly, not dramatically. Just a degree or two cooler. You carry that degree cooler feeling through the rest of the day. By evening, it has settled into something you cannot quite name, and at night, it speaks. Jung had a precise framework for understanding why comparison is so psychologically costly. It involves what he called the persona. Think of a specific kind of evening. You have had a reasonable day. Not triumphant, not difficult, ordinary. And in the evening, almost without intending to, you find yourself looking at something online. A former colleague's announcement. A photograph from someone's life that looks, in its carefully selected framing, like the life you imagined you might be living by now. Or a version of success that resembles what you once told yourself you wanted. The feeling that arrives is not dramatic. It does not flatten you. It is more like a slight shift in atmospheric pressure. Everything in the room looks the same. But something has changed by a degree that you cannot point to and cannot shake. You carry it to bed. And in the dark, the comparison runs deeper. It reaches further back. It finds more evidence. Because that is what comparison does in the night, it excavates rather than assesses. It looks for corroboration of the worst interpretation, and the night mind, less defended than the day mind, tends to find it. The man who saw the announcement at 7 p.m. is at midnight not merely thinking about one missed moment. He is conducting a quiet trial of his entire life's trajectory. And the verdict, somehow, always seems to arrive before all the evidence is in. This is the second hurt in its full form. Not a single comparison, but the accumulated weight of a day spent measuring yourself against an infinite and entirely curated field. Jung had words for this. He would say, the persona you are comparing yourself to is not a person, it is a performance, and you are comparing that performance to your private reality. The comparison is structurally unfair before it even begins. The persona is the mask, not in the deceptive sense, though it can become that. The persona is the version of yourself you have built for the social world. It includes your professional self, your relational self, the presentation you have learned to make to receive belonging and recognition. Every human being has a persona. Every human being needs one. The question is, how much of your actual identity has been handed over to it? When you compare yourself to others, you are almost always comparing your interior reality, your private doubts, your quiet failures, your unfinished work, to their exterior persona, their highlight against your backstage. And the unconscious knows this comparison is unfair, but the psyche still registers the wound. Let your shoulders drop a little. There is nothing to fix in this moment. Throughout a day saturated with social media, with carefully edited presentations of other people's lives, with professional achievements announced in real time, and acquisitions photographed, and relationships performed for audiences, the average person conducts hundreds of small comparisons, most of them below the threshold of deliberate thought. A glance at a colleague's office, a friend's vacation posted in the afternoon, a former classmate's success that arrives through the algorithm at exactly the wrong moment, a headline about someone your age who has done something remarkable. Each comparison is a small drain, not because you are vain or envious or spiritually underdeveloped, because you are human. The social comparison reflex is ancient and automatic. We evolved to track our standing within the group. That tracking system has not changed. What has changed is the scale of the group we are now comparing ourselves to. For most of human history, you compared yourself to the 50 or 200 people you could actually see. Now the comparison field is limitless, and the ones who appear most frequently in that field are the ones whose lives photograph best. Jung observed that the more a person lives in the persona, the more the outer performance becomes the primary self, the more alienated they become from the inner reality. The comparison game is, at its root, a game played entirely in the persona realm. You are comparing performances. And no performance, no matter how accomplished, can satisfy the deeper self. Because the deeper self does not care about performance. It cares about authenticity, about contact with real experience, about feeling genuinely alive rather than successfully presented. And this is where the second hurt becomes a night hurt. The comparisons you made today have deposited a subtle residue, a feeling of not enoughness that does not have a specific name or a specific origin, because it accumulated gradually in small doses across many moments. By bedtime, it has no address. It is simply there, diffuse, quiet, persistent, and the mind, trying to work with it, circles. Chapter 8. Envy, Persona, and Inner Erosion. The word envy carries a weight that most people disown quickly. I am not an envious person. Perhaps, but envy is not a character trait. It is a signal, and Jung was deeply interested in what it signals. Envy, in the Jungian framework, points not to what you want from the other person, it points to what you want for yourself and fear you will never have. The object of envy is never really the other person's house or career or relationship. It is the feeling you imagine they must have inside those things. Peace, perhaps. Belonging. The sense of having arrived somewhere you cannot name but have always been looking for. When you strip the envy down to its signal, it says, "There is something here I have not yet honored in myself. That is worth sitting with." Because if envy is a signal, then the appropriate response is not shame. It is curiosity. What is this pointing toward? What have I been putting off? What do I secretly value that I have convinced myself is not for me? The persona comes back here in an important way. When a person's life is lived primarily through the persona, through the performed, approved, external self, the authentic desires of the inner self begin to leak, not through conscious expression, but through projection. We see in others what we have not permitted ourselves to pursue, and we call that envy. Jung called this mechanism projection, placing an inner reality onto an outer screen. The qualities you most admire in others and most resent not having are often qualities that exist within you but have been suppressed by the requirements of the persona. The person who envies someone's courage may be sitting on a reservoir of their own unused courage. The person who envies someone's creative freedom may have spent decades convincing themselves that creativity is not practical, not serious, not theirs to claim. The envy is not a flaw, it is a map. Let the next breath come slower. Now, during the day, you may not have time to follow that map. The day is full. The comparisons happen quickly and are quickly suppressed. I should not feel this. I am grateful for what I have. I know better. All of that is true, and none of it resolves the underlying signal. And so at night, the map appears again. The feeling without a name that circles in the quiet. The vague dissatisfaction that sleep has not fixed. The waking at 3 with a chest that feels heavy and a mind that will not say why. This is inner erosion. Not the dramatic crisis, but the slow wearing away of contact with the authentic self. Through years of comparison, through the daily habit of measuring yourself against others' presentations and finding yourself privately below the threshold of words, slightly less than. The accumulation of that feeling is significant. Jung worked with many people in the second half of life who arrived not in crisis but in confusion. Their lives were objectively successful, and they felt hollow. He understood this as the result of having lived primarily outward, of having served the persona at the expense of the self. The second hurt is comparison, but the deeper wound is what comparison does over time to the relationship between the person you perform and the person you actually are. And that wound speaks at night, quietly, persistently, without drama, just as a low-grade ache in the bones speaks. Not enough to immobilize, just enough to prevent true rest. We're going to come back to this, to the question of the authentic self beneath the persona. It is, in some ways, the heart of everything we are discussing tonight. But before we move on, there is one thing worth sitting with a moment longer. The map that envy provides is not useless. In fact, Jung would say it is one of the most honest maps available to us, precisely because it arrives unbidden and without the editing that conscious desire undergoes. When you feel envious of someone's creative life, you have not consciously constructed that feeling. It simply arose. And in its arising, it reveals something that the conscious mind might have found too risky to admit directly. I want more of this. I have set aside something that mattered. I am living further from myself than I intended. That is information, not comfortable information. Not information that resolves easily into a plan or a next step, but genuine information. And genuine information, received honestly rather than suppressed quickly, becomes the material of real change. Not overnight, not without difficulty, but the direction it points toward is not imaginary. It points toward the self that the persona was built to protect, and, in some ways, built to replace. And the self that was replaced is still there, still pointing, still patient, still hoping that one night, in the quiet, you will notice where the finger is aimed and decide to look. Chapter 9, The Third Hurt, Suppressing Real Feelings. Here is a question worth asking gently. When was the last time you let yourself feel something completely? Not performed feeling, not the appropriate response to the situation, not the emotion you chose because it was acceptable or expected or would not disrupt the room, the actual feeling, whatever it was, felt fully. without redirection. For many people, the honest answer is not recently. And for some, the honest answer is, I am not sure I remember how. This is not a failure. It is, again, an ordinary consequence of how we are taught to manage inner life in a world that rewards composure. As children, most of us received a set of instructions, spoken or unspoken, about which feelings were welcome and which were not. Be strong, calm down, there is nothing to cry about. Pull yourself together, you are fine. These instructions were often delivered with love. They were also, in the Jungian framework, the beginning of what he called the shadow. The shadow is the part of the psyche that receives everything we judge as unacceptable. The anger that is not allowed, the grief that must not be shown, the fear that would make others uncomfortable, the longing that seems too vulnerable to admit. All of it goes somewhere. It does not disappear because we do not express it. It goes into the shadow. Let your body be heavy where it rests. You do not need to hold yourself up right now. The shadow is not evil. That is a common misunderstanding of Jung's concept. The shadow is simply the rejected self. The feelings and traits and desires that did not receive permission to exist in conscious life, they are as real and as vital as the accepted parts. They just live underground, and underground they have significant influence. Think of a man at work who has been passed over for a promotion he worked hard for. He says he is fine. He genuinely tries to believe this. He is professional, composed, reasonable. The feeling of injustice and hurt and disappointment, he moves through it quickly because to linger would feel self-indulgent. He spends the rest of the day performing normalcy. By evening, he is exhausted in a way that seems disproportionate to the day. He snaps at something minor at home and is confused by his own reaction. He lies awake, running through scenarios he thought he had already put to rest. The suppressed feeling did not leave, it just changed forms. The irritability at home is the feeling in disguise. The sleeplessness is the feeling demanding attention. The looping thoughts are the psyche trying to process something that was denied the chance to be felt during the day. Jung saw this pattern with extraordinary consistency. He noted that the more rigidly a person controls their emotional life during the day, the more disruptive the unconscious becomes at night. Not as punishment, again, never as punishment, but as compensation. The psyche is always seeking balance. What is suppressed above the surface exerts pressure from below, and the night is when that pressure most clearly shows. Here is what is true and perhaps worth hearing. Feeling your feelings is not weakness. In the Jungian framework, it is the prerequisite for psychological health. The person who can sit with anger without acting on it destructively, who can acknowledge grief without drowning in it, who can feel fear without being ruled by it, that person is psychologically integrated in a way that the compulsively composed person is not. Strength is not the absence of feeling. Strength is the capacity to feel without being destroyed by the feeling. That is one of the quietest and most important things Jung spent a lifetime trying to demonstrate. And tonight, if you can allow yourself to simply acknowledge, not solve, not express, just acknowledge what you are carrying, something may loosen slightly, not dramatically, not all at once, just the way ice begins to ease at the first hint of warmth. There is a particular kind of Wednesday that many people know. Nothing went wrong exactly. The day was managed. The deadlines were met. At 5:30, the computer closed and the commute began. And somewhere between the parking lot and the front door, the face that the day required began to quietly dissolve. Not completely, not safely enough to show the actual dissolution. But the man who walked into the office at 8 that morning is not quite the same man who walks into his house at 6. The difference is not visible. It is felt. His wife asks if he is all right. He says yes. He believes in the moment that he is saying something true, because the answer, "I am processing 17 different feelings that were not allowed any space today," would be too complicated and too much to ask her to receive. So, yes, fine. But the feelings do not dissolve because they are not named. They wait for the moment the house is quiet, the lights are off, and the accumulated charge of the unsaid becomes the only sound in the room. That is not a malfunction. That is a psyche doing its best with an inheritance that taught it to perform rather than feel. Understanding that inheritance is the beginning of gently rewriting it. Chapter 10. What the Shadow Does with Silence. In 1913, Carl Jung experienced what he later described as one of the most difficult periods of his life. He had recently ended his relationship with Sigmund Freud, a professional and personal rupture that left him, at 38, professionally isolated and psychologically unmoored. Friends fell away. His sense of direction collapsed. He began experiencing visions during the day, images arriving unbidden, faces he did not recognize, voices he could not locate. Another psychiatrist in his position might have diagnosed himself. Jung chose instead to listen. He sat at his desk, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early morning hours, and began writing down the images, not analyzing them immediately, not trying to make them stop, just recording, drawing, letting the inner material have its say. What emerged was a manuscript he kept almost entirely private for the rest of his life. He called it the Red Book. It was, in the most literal sense, Jung making contact with his own shadow. Not the shadows of his patients, his own, the parts of himself he had professionally bypassed. The parts that were terrifying and strange and did not fit the image of the respected clinician and intellectual. He sat with them. He gave them form. He allowed them to speak. And on the other side of that encounter, he emerged with the theoretical framework that would define his life's work. The shadow, he realized, was not the enemy. It was the source. Let your breath find its own rhythm. There is nothing required of you right now except presence. Now consider what happens to the shadow in the context of modern daily life. We are extraordinarily good at suppression. We have developed cultural skills for managing inner material quickly and efficiently. Feel something uncomfortable? Name it as something less threatening. A flash of grief becomes just being tired. A spike of anger becomes overreacting. A moment of genuine longing becomes it doesn't matter. The feeling is rerouted. The shadow grows. And in silence, in the particular silence of night, when there is nothing left to manage, the shadow attempts its return. This is the fundamental dynamic behind the sleepless mind. Not that bad things are in there, but that real things are in there. And real things do not accept indefinite suppression. They find the gaps. They speak through the body, the tightness in the chest, the shallow breathing, the inexplicable heaviness. They speak through the mind, the circular thoughts, the 3 a.m. inventory, the scenarios that seem to have no beginning and no end. The shadow is not trying to harm you. It is trying to be integrated. Jung spent decades developing methods for this integration. Active imagination, dream analysis, symbolic reflection. All of them shared a common root: the willingness to turn toward the inner material rather than away from it. The man who could not name his feelings after the missed promotion, his shadow held those feelings. The grief, the anger, the fear that the missed promotion confirmed a deeper fear about his worth. All of that was real. All of it needed not to be fixed, but to be felt. There is a phrase that surfaces in Jungian thought that has outlasted many of his more technical concepts. What you resist persists. It is not originally his phrasing, but he demonstrated it with clinical precision for 50 years. The shadow does not diminish through suppression, it grows, and in silence it rises. Tonight, we are not going to try to resolve everything the shadow holds. That is not the work of a single night. But we can at least give it a little acknowledgement. The feelings in there, whatever they are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are evidence that you are alive, that you have been hurt and hoped and tried and lost and tried again, that you are a full human being, not a performance of one. The shadow holds your full humanity, and when you stop fighting it quite so hard, the night becomes a little quieter. There is a practical dimension to this that is worth making clear. You do not need to undergo formal therapy to begin working with the shadow. You do not need to sit in active imagination for hours or analyze every dream. Jung himself said that sometimes the most powerful shadow work is the simplest. It is the moment you catch yourself reacting strongly to something in another person and ask, what does this reaction say about me? Not in a self-critical way, in a genuinely curious way. The colleague whose need for attention irritates you, is there something there about your own unmet need to be recognized? The friend whose expressiveness makes you uncomfortable, is there something there about your own suppressed emotional life? The person in the news story whose behavior provokes your most intense condemnation, where, if anywhere, do the faintest traces of that behavior exist in you, expressed perhaps in more socially acceptable forms? These questions are not accusations, they are inquiries. The shadow does not ask for confessions, it asks for honesty. And honesty with yourself, practiced gently and consistently, is one of the most powerful things you can bring to the sleepless night. Because when the shadow is acknowledged in the day, it does not need to press so hard in the dark. The pressure eases in proportion to the acknowledgement. Not all at once, but measurably, one honest moment at a time. Chapter 11, The Fourth Hurt, Living for Approval. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not show up in the body. It lives just beneath the surface of every social interaction. It is the cost of tracking continuously what others think of you, whether you said the right thing, whether you are perceived the way you intended, whether the way you presented yourself today was good enough to warrant the belonging you are looking for. Most people are unaware they are doing this. It is so constant, so automatic, that it feels like simply being a person in the world. But it is a form of labor, and it never stops. Jung called the social self the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre. The persona is not false, exactly. It is a necessary part of how we navigate the social world. The version of yourself that is appropriate for the workplace is different from the version at home, which is different again from the private version that only you know. But the persona becomes dangerous when it is the only self you inhabit. When you begin to believe the mask is the face. When your sense of worth depends entirely on the audience's response. Think of a woman who has spent most of her adult life being very good at reading rooms. She knows almost instantly what each situation calls for, what will be well received, what will cause discomfort, what version of herself is most welcome here. She adapts quickly and smoothly. People like her. But she has not, in years, been entirely herself. Not because she is dishonest, because she has lost track of where the performance ends and the person begins. And at night, when the audience is gone, she finds herself in the peculiar position of not knowing who she is for. That absence is its own kind of vertigo. Just notice the weight of your own body for a moment. You are real. You are here. Living for approval is not vanity. It is, in its origins, fear. The fear of rejection, the fear of being seen clearly and found wanting. The fear that the authentic self, with its contradictions and imperfections and honest needs, would not be welcome. And so the persona is built carefully over years. What we do not realize until it has been happening for a long time is the cost. Approval seeking is exhausting not only because of the energy it requires during the day, but because of what it prevents at night. The persona requires constant maintenance. Approval requires constant monitoring. And the mind, having spent the day in that continuous monitoring mode, cannot easily switch it off at bedtime. It replays conversations. It revises what was said. It anticipates tomorrow's assessments. This is not neurosis. This is the predictable behavior of a psyche that has been taught to live outside itself. And the cure is not more effort. The cure is something much harder. It is the willingness, gradually and gently, to let the inner self have a little more room. There is a kind of late evening most people have experienced. The last obligation is finished. The last performance is over. You are, for the first time all day, alone with yourself. And the question that surfaces quietly, without drama, is this: what do I actually want right now? Not what should I do next, not what would be productive, not what would look right if anyone were watching. What do I want? For many people, this question produces a pause that surprises them. The wanting has been submerged under so many layers of what is appropriate and what is expected that accessing it directly takes a moment. The inner preference has been consulted so rarely that it is not immediately fluent. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about what a life lived primarily in the persona costs. The approval-seeking self is extraordinarily skilled at reading external cues. It knows exactly what will be well received. It is fast and accurate in its social calibration. But it has traded that skill partly for the slower, quieter capacity to know what it itself needs. And at night, that trade shows itself. The person who is very good at pleasing others often arrives at bed without knowing how to please themselves with rest. They cannot settle, because settling requires a level of self-permission that has not been practiced. The mind that runs the approval check all day does not know when to stop running it, and so it runs, reviewing, revising, pre-evaluating tomorrow's interactions. This is not hyperactivity or anxiety as a disorder. It is the natural behavior of a system that was never given an off signal. And the off signal, it turns out, comes not from outside, but from within. From the inner self which has always known when it was safe to stop. The question is whether you trust it enough to listen. Chapter 12. Persona Exhaustion at Night. There is a specific moment that many people recognize without ever having named it. You close the front door, or you hang up the phone after the last work call, or you finish the dinner where you were for 2 hours, the version of yourself that keeps things comfortable and pleasant and forward-moving. And something drops, not dramatically, just slightly, like a person stepping out of shoes that have been on too long. This is persona exhaustion. The particular fatigue that comes not from doing hard things, but from sustaining a version of yourself that, however appropriate and necessary, takes continuous effort to maintain. Jung described individuation, the process of becoming more fully yourself, as the work of the second half of life. He meant it literally. The first half is often spent constructing the persona, building the social self that can function effectively in the world. The second half, if all goes well, is spent discovering what lives beneath it. But the second half only begins when the first half's work is honestly examined. And that examination happens most naturally in the quiet, in the hours after the persona has been laid down, in the night. Think of a man in his late 50s who has been, by any reasonable standard, successful. A career that commands respect. A family that functions. A reputation that opens doors. He has been the version of himself that all of those things required for more years than he can easily count, and he does not know any more what he would do if no one were watching, not in a dramatic, existential crisis sense. In the quieter sense of genuinely not having checked in with the inner self for so long that it has become a stranger, he lies in the dark and the persona has no function here. And the silence, without the persona to fill it, is unusual. Just let the next breath be a little slower. The persona exhaustion is real. It is not weakness. It is the cost of living, which all of us pay in different currencies. And Jung's insight, one of his most useful and most actionable, is this: the persona is not the enemy. It never was. The problem is not that it exists. The problem is when there is nothing else. When you have no language for what you feel outside the approved categories. No relationship with the interior world that developed alongside the exterior one. No practice of simply being as opposed to performing. The night becomes in that absence both a problem and an opportunity. A problem because the silence is uncomfortable, because the inner world, unattended for years, has become unfamiliar territory. An opportunity because the silence is honest, because what surfaces in the quiet is not invented, because beneath the persona, Jung insisted, with the conviction of a man who had traveled that territory himself, there is something real, a self that has been waiting, with patience that is almost impossible to overstate, and it is not angry that you have been busy. It is not demanding anything dramatic of you tonight. It only wants to be acknowledged. Just for a moment, just in the quiet. Jung's individuation was not a destination that, once reached, changes everything. It was more gradual and more honest than that. He described it as a process of becoming. Not becoming something you are not, but becoming more fully what you always were, beneath the accumulated adaptations. The persona was necessary. Every mask you wore was worn for a reason. The professional distance, the emotional composure, the smile that said fine when the honest answer was more complicated. All of it made something possible. It navigated something real. The work of the second half of life is not to condemn those masks. It is to wear them a little more lightly, to know the difference between choosing the appropriate mask for a given situation and having lost track of the face underneath. One of Jung's most striking observations was this: that people who have done the work of individuation do not become more fragile as they age. They become more solid, more themselves, less concerned with whether the performance landed correctly, less anxious about the audience's response. There is a word for this, though it is too easily used and too rarely truly meant. Integrity. Not the behavioral kind, keeping promises, acting ethically. The deeper kind. The state of being integrated, of knowing who you are beneath the layers, of having a relationship with the self that persists even when the persona is set down. That integrity is what the persona Exhaustion is pointing toward. Not collapse, not crisis. A direction. The direction of the inner life. And the journey in that direction begins in small moments. Moments just like this one. Chapter 13, The Fifth Hurt, Unfinished Conversations. Picture a kitchen. Late evening. The dishes are done. The house is quiet. Someone is sitting at the table, not doing anything, not looking at anything in particular, just sitting. They are replaying a conversation from earlier today. Maybe this morning, maybe last week. They are replaying it with the particular focus of a person who did not get to say what they needed to say, or who said something they did not mean, or who walked away from a moment of conflict without resolution. And now, in the quiet, the conversation continues on its own. Better version, clearer wording, the argument they should have made, the question they should have asked, the anger they held back, the hurt they did not show. The kitchen table at midnight knows more about their inner life than most of the people in their daily world. This is the fifth hurt. Unfinished conversations. Jung understood conflict as a form of psychic energy. When two people meet in genuine disagreement, when something real is at stake between them, that energy is aroused. And energy that is aroused but not discharged does not evaporate, it circulates. It looks for resolution. When the conversation ends without one, the circulating energy turns inward. The mind becomes both parties. It runs both sides of the argument. It rehearses. It revises. It tries to reach, through imagination, the resolution the actual conversation did not provide. This is not unhealthy in itself. It is the psyche doing what it was designed to do. Seek coherence. Seek understanding. Seek the sense of completion that comes from genuinely being heard. The problem is that the imagined conversation can never fully satisfy what only the real conversation could. And so it runs and runs. And at 3 a.m, it is still running. Let your jaw soften. Notice the quiet in the room around you. There is a particular cruelty to unfinished conflict, not the cruelty of the other person, but the cruelty of the loop itself. It is the most efficient way to occupy the mind at night, because each revision generates a new variable, which generates a new scenario, which calls for another revision. The mind working on an unfinished conversation is not unlike a program searching for a file that does not exist. It will search indefinitely, consuming resources, finding nothing. Jung believed that one of the most important psychological skills is the capacity to sit with unresolved conflict without compulsively trying to resolve it in the imagination, which is easier to describe than to practice. But there is a beginning. It starts with recognizing the loop for what it is. Not a problem to be solved tonight, not a failure to have experienced it, just the mind doing what minds do with things that matter, trying, imperfectly, to finish what life left open. You can let the loop continue tonight if it needs to, but you do not have to be inside it. There is a position slightly to the side of the loop, watching it run, knowing it is there, knowing also that it cannot be resolved by thinking harder, revising more carefully, or finding the perfect words at 2 a.m. The conversation, if it needs finishing, will be finished in the world. Tonight, the most generous thing you can do for your sleeping mind is let it know, we are done working on this for now. It does not have to believe you completely. Just give it permission to try. Here is something that is worth understanding about the replay. The mind runs the loop not because it is broken, and not because the situation was unusually severe. It runs the loop because somewhere in the conversation, something real was at stake. A need was not met. A feeling was not received. A part of you was reached for connection or understanding, and the moment passed without it. The replay is not a rehearsal for the next argument. It is grief. The grief of a moment that mattered and did not land the way it needed to. And grief, treated as a problem to solve, does not resolve. It deepens. Grief treated as a feeling to be witnessed gently without rushing toward resolution does something different. It moves, not on the first night, but across many nights of small acknowledgement, something shifts. The loop gradually loses urgency. The words become less sharp. The need beneath the conversation begins to find other ways to be addressed, sometimes through the actual conversation, sometimes through a different kind of honesty, sometimes simply through the acknowledgement to yourself of what you actually needed and did not receive. This is not passive. It is a specific kind of internal work, and it happens at night, in the quiet, when the ego's defenses are lower and the truth can be a little more honest with itself. The fifth hurt is unfinished conversations. But the deeper function of the night mind running the loop is this. It is trying to give you something you were not given in the moment. Understanding. And understanding begins with yourself. Chapter 14. Conflict that returns after midnight. Jung observed that conflict does not arrive neutral. It arrives with a history. The argument you had today about something specific, a decision, a misunderstanding, a moment of thoughtlessness from someone who should have known better, carries within it a long chain of previous experiences, previous conflicts, previous moments of not being heard, previous instances of the same feeling wearing different faces. This is what he called the complex at work. A complex, in Jungian terms, is not a disorder. It is an organized cluster of feeling, memory, and association gathered around a central emotional theme. You might have a complex around abandonment, or around control, or around worth. Most people have several. When a current conflict touches the complex, the reaction is often larger than the situation calls for. Not because you are irrational, because you are carrying more than today. The wife who becomes disproportionately distressed when her husband forgets to call may not be reacting only to today's forgetfulness. She may be feeling, through that forgetfulness, the sum of many moments in which she was not considered. Not all of them from this marriage. Some of them from much longer ago. The man who goes completely quiet after a minor criticism at work is not simply responding to the criticism, he is responding to everything the criticism has touched. The critical voice he internalized long before he ever set foot in an office. The complaint that seems small activates the complex that is large, and at night the complex does not sort itself back into neat, historical categories. It presents as feeling without origin, hurt without a name, an anger or sadness or anxiety that seems to have no specific address. Let the weight of the body sink a little deeper. There is nothing to straighten out tonight. This is one of the most important things Jung taught. Through his clinical work, the presenting problem is rarely the actual problem. The conflict on the surface points to a system of feeling that exists in the depths. Resolving the surface conflict alone leaves the system intact. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for a particular kind of patience with yourself, most of all. When the night mind circles a conflict that happened today, it is doing something more complex than just reviewing the facts. It is trying to locate the feeling within the larger landscape of your history, to give it a home, to understand why it hurts as much as it does. That is not irrational. That is the psyche trying to integrate experience. It just needs a gentler environment than a 3 a.m. internal courtroom. Here is something small but real. The next time a conflict returns after midnight, you might try something other than trying to solve it or suppress it. You might try naming what is oldest about the feeling, not the specific event, the theme. Is this about being seen, about being safe, about being enough, about being left? When you can name the oldest layer, something sometimes shifts. Not because you have solved it, but because you have recognized it. And recognition, in Jung's work, is always the beginning. The conflict will find its resolution in time and in the waking world. Tonight, just notice what it is made of. Jung worked with a patient once, and he recorded variations of this experience across many years of practice, who came to him unable to sleep for weeks following an argument with her son. On the surface, the argument was about a decision the son had made, a practical matter, nothing catastrophic. But the insomnia was catastrophic in its persistence. When Jung worked with her carefully, what emerged was not the son's decision. What emerged was a much older grief. The feeling of not having been listened to in her own childhood. A mother who made decisions for her rather than with her. A pattern of authority and submission that she had spent decades managing, and that her son's decision, entirely unwittingly, had reactivated. The argument was real, but it was also a door. Behind the door was 40 years of a particular feeling, and the feeling, once named, the grief of not being considered, not being asked, not being trusted to have a valid perspective, began to move. The insomnia resolved within a week, not because the argument was resolved. The relationship with the son took more time, but because the weight of the older feeling had been acknowledged. This is what Jung meant by working at depth rather than at the surface. The presenting problem is rarely the only problem, and the presenting sleeplessness is rarely only about tonight. When you name what is oldest about the feeling, when you trace the current conflict back to the underlying theme it is touching, something loosens. Not because the past is changed, because it is finally seen, and what has been seen cannot maintain the same grip in the dark. Here is something worth knowing about the unguarded self. It is not what you fear it is. Most people, if they are honest, carry an anxiety about what might be found if the management ceased entirely, if the composure dropped, if the persona loosened beyond the gradual easing of sleep's approach, they expect to find chaos, grief of a size that would be unmanageable, anger that would be inappropriate, need that would be embarrassing, longing that would seem too large for an ordinary adult life to accommodate. They expect the unguarded self to be a problem. What Jung found consistently and across decades of this work was something different. The unguarded self is not chaotic. It is, underneath the unfamiliarity of first contact, coherent. It has a quality that the persona, for all its skills and sophistication, does not always have. It is authentic. The unguarded self knows what it values. It knows what matters. It is not confused about the large things, even when it is uncertain about the small ones. It has a clear orientation toward what is real, what is true, what is actually important, as opposed to what has been trained into importance by decades of external reinforcement. This is the self that arrives in the pre-sleep state. And yes, it brings things with it. The feelings that were not processed, the questions that were deferred. The small accumulations of a day lived largely outside itself. But these are not chaos. They are the contents of a life. And a life's contents, when held gently and without judgment, are not a burden. They are the evidence of being alive in the fullest sense. The mask does not disturb sleep because the unguarded self is dangerous. It disturbs sleep because the transition between them is abrupt, unmapped, and unaccompanied. The practice, and we will touch this again before this night is over, is simply to make the transition less abrupt, to create a little more space between the persona and the sleep state, to give the unguarded self a few minutes of acknowledged presence before it has to assert itself through restlessness. That small invitation changes everything, not all at once, but in the particular way that small acts of honesty always do, gradually and then eventually deeply. Chapter 15, The Sixth Hurt, Filling Every Quiet Moment. We have talked about the noise, about the screen, about the loop of the unfinished conversation. But there is another version of the sixth hurt that is quieter than all of those. It is the filling, not scrolling necessarily, not a specific distraction, just the pervasive, habitual impulse to ensure that no moment is empty, that every gap is occupied. That silence, wherever it begins to form, is addressed. This is not always digital. Sometimes it is the radio in the car turned on immediately upon entering, the podcast that plays while making coffee, the television murmuring in the background, not because anyone is watching it, but because the alternative, quiet, is somehow harder. The instinct to fill quiet is very human. It is also, in the modern world, very easy to act on, and it has consequences. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. We seeded that observation at the beginning of this conversation. Now we can look at it more closely. The tiredness that sleep cannot fix is not physical tiredness. It is the fatigue of a psyche that has never been given the input it actually needs, because every moment of potential interiority has been occupied by something external. Just notice the air moving in and out. The inner life has a metabolism. It needs to digest experience before it can make meaning from it. It needs periods of internal quiet, not meditative silence necessarily, but simply time without new input to process what has already arrived. When every quiet moment is filled, this digestion cannot happen. The experiences accumulate unprocessed. The feelings arrive and are immediately covered over. The insights that come only in stillness never surface. And the psyche, denied its natural processing rhythm, becomes congested. This is not a medical term. It is an image for what Jung was describing when he talked about the modern person's estrangement from the symbolic life. We are full of experience and short of meaning, not because the experience was not meaningful, but because we never paused long enough to find out what it meant. The filling is not laziness, and it is not stupidity. It is often anxiety avoidance. The quiet, as we noted earlier, allows the inner voice to be heard, and the inner voice sometimes says uncomfortable things. Things about the life we are living, the choices we have made, the person we have become in the years of busy filling. It is understandable to prefer the podcast, but the cost accumulates, and at night, when the filling finally stops, when there are no more podcasts, no more news, no more murmuring television, what surfaces is not the inner life at its best. It is the inner life at its most frustrated. The backlog of unprocessed experience. The accumulated pressure of everything that has been quietly, continuously, indefinitely deferred. This is not a comfortable arrival. It is, however, an honest one. And Jung would say, this honesty, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of something genuine. The filling is the sixth hurt. Not because filling time is wrong, but because it has quietly become a way of never being alone with yourself. And the self, your actual self, the one beneath the performance and the busyness and the continuous noise, has been waiting. We spoke of that earlier. It is still true now. There is a man, and this is a composite of many. Men, many people, who has spent the last 40 years being genuinely good at things, not celebrated for being good, just quietly, reliably, consistently capable, the kind of person that systems depend on without acknowledging, the kind whose value is assumed rather than recognized. He has spent 40 years moving from one task to the next with the efficiency of someone who was taught early that stillness is indulgence. On a recent Sunday, a Sunday with no obligations, no errands, nothing scheduled, he sat for 20 minutes in a chair and did nothing. not meditating, not resting deliberately, just sitting. And in those 20 minutes, things surfaced. Not dramatic revelations, ordinary ones. The memory of a project he had cared about 20 years ago that was set aside for practical reasons and never returned to, the thought of a friendship that had quietly faded during a decade of being too busy. The recognition that he is happy, genuinely, in many ways happy, and that happiness coexists without contradiction with a persistent longing for something he has never quite named. Those 20 minutes of sitting were the most honest 20 minutes of his recent year, not because anything happened, because he finally stopped filling. And when you stop filling long enough, what arrives is not emptiness, it is your actual life, asking for a little acknowledgement. That is what the sixth hurt has been keeping at a distance. Not boredom, not the void, your actual life. And it is worth more than the next podcast. Chapter 16, Why Solitude Can Feel Threatening. Blaise Pascal wrote in the 17th century that all of humanity's problems stem from an inability to sit quietly alone in a room. He was not prescribing meditation. He was making a clinical observation. Pascal was himself a person of extraordinary intellectual vitality, a mathematician who made foundational contributions to probability and physics before he was 25. He understood the addictive quality of mental stimulation. He understood what it felt like to use that stimulation as a way of avoiding the interior silence he simultaneously feared and craved. He sat with the paradox. He wrote about it. He named it. And it has been true in every century since. Solitude is threatening for a specific reason. When you are alone and quiet, the audience is gone. And without the audience, the persona has nothing to perform for. The version of yourself that exists in relation to others, that is validated or rejected or seen or overlooked by others, goes quiet. And what remains is harder to name. In the Jungian language, what remains in solitude is the encounter with the self. Not the ego, which is the organizing center of conscious life, not the persona, which is the social mask. The self, which Jung used with a capital S to indicate the full wholeness of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. Most people in modern life rarely encounter this, not because they are shallow or uninterested, because the culture provides no map and very little encouragement for the inward journey. And so, when solitude arrives, enforced by illness or retirement, or the emptying of a house that was once full of children, or simply the arrival of a quiet Sunday with no plans, it can feel, paradoxically, dangerous. Not the solitude of a vacation, not the solitude of chosen retreat, but the solitude that reveals itself when there is nothing left to do and no one left to perform for. This solitude is the sixth hurt's deeper layer, because when we fill every quiet moment, we are not simply passing time. We are, at some level, avoiding this encounter. And the avoidance is costly not because the encounter would be terrible, it would not be, but because the energy used to avoid it does not disappear. It shows up at night as the restlessness of a psyche that cannot settle, because settling would mean arriving somewhere it has been carefully keeping at a distance. Let the next breath be slow. Jung spent his entire career arguing that this encounter with the inner self is not something to fear, but something to seek. That the interior journey, however uncomfortable its early stages, leads to a kind of groundedness and peace that the exterior life, however successful, cannot provide. He was right. But he also acknowledged that the beginning is hard. The beginning is the moment in the dark when the noise is gone and the persona has nothing to do and the self you have been avoiding is simply there, waiting, with an expression you cannot read. It is all right not to know what to do with that yet. You do not have to know. You only have to let it be present. And already, in letting it be present, something small and real begins to change. Pascal spent the last years of his life largely in that quiet room he wrote about. Not in misery, in a kind of productive depth he had not previously known, despite his brilliant and relentlessly outward earlier career. What he found in the room, what most people find when they sit long enough with the discomfort of their own company, was not emptiness. It was texture, the actual texture of their experience, as distinct from the summarized version they had been presenting to themselves and others, the specific memory that had never quite been processed, the longing with a specific shape rather than a diffuse ache. The question that was not philosophical in the abstract sense, but personal in the most immediate sense. What am I actually doing? What do I actually want? What have I been carrying that I do not have to carry? These questions arrive in solitude. They do not arrive in the noise. The noise is precisely what prevents them, and when they arrive, when solitude creates enough space for the genuine questions to form, something paradoxical happens. The questions are uncomfortable, and the person is more at ease. Because there is something deeply relieving about honest contact with your own experience, even when that experience is difficult. It is the relief of a body coming home, of a traveller setting down luggage they have been carrying so long they forgot it was heavy. The solitude that feels threatening from the outside is, from the inside, a homecoming, and the night is offering that homecoming every evening. The question is simply whether you are willing to arrive. Chapter 17, The Seventh Hurt, Caffeine and Restlessness, this chapter, is shorter than the others. Not because it is less important, but because its mechanism is simpler. Caffeine is a psychoactive substance that works primarily by blocking adenosine receptors, adenosine being the chemical signal in the brain that accumulates throughout the day and gradually builds the feeling of sleepiness. Caffeine does not eliminate adenosine. It prevents you from feeling it. The adenosine continues to accumulate behind the blockade. And when the caffeine clears, the accumulated adenosine arrives in one wave. This is why the crash after coffee is real. And this is part of why the half-life of caffeine, which is roughly 5 to 7 hours for most adults, and longer as we age, matters enormously for sleep quality. A cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon can still be influencing your nervous system at 9 in the evening. But the Jungian dimension of caffeine is less often discussed. And it is worth a moment. Caffeine is culturally a way of demanding wakefulness from a body that may be asking for rest. It is a form of overriding the body's natural signals. Not once, not as an emergency measure, but habitually, daily, often multiple times a day. This is a small but consistent act of refusing to listen to the interior. Just notice where your body is resting. The body is an intelligent system. It signals tiredness for a reason, because rest is required for the processing, integrating, and restoring that happen during sleep. When we override that signal repeatedly, we do not eliminate the need, we defer it. And deferred tiredness, deferred processing, deferred rest, all of it accumulates. The man who drinks 4 cups of coffee to maintain the performance of productivity is not simply managing his energy. He is, over time, creating a debt that his nighttime self must absorb. The anxious, restless quality of the caffeinated mind at bedtime is not entirely psychological. Some of it is chemical. But the two are not separate. An overstimulated nervous system and an overextended psyche speak the same language, and the language is restlessness. There is no philosophy required here. Only the practical acknowledgement that the body needs what it needs, and that listening to it, which is, in Jung's framework, a form of listening to the unconscious, is a form of respect for yourself, for the inner life that happens in sleep, for the processing that makes tomorrow possible. The 7th hurt is simple, but it is also, for many people, the one they most resist addressing, because the coffee is not just about energy. It is about the story of who you are. Capable, productive, not someone who needs rest at 2 in the afternoon. The persona again, always the persona, and beneath it, always the body, trying quietly to tell you something true. Chapter 18, The Body, Anxiety, and the Overactive Mind. Anxiety lives in the body before it lives in the mind. Most people do not realize this. They experience anxiety as a thought pattern, the catastrophizing, the worst-case scenario construction, the circular worry, and they try to address it through thinking, through reasoning with the anxious mind. Jung would have said, "You are beginning too late. By the time the anxious thought has formed, the body has already been speaking for some time. The shallow breath, the tightened jaw, the held shoulders, the subtle contraction of the gut. These are not symptoms of the anxiety. They are, in some ways, the anxiety itself, expressed in the language the body speaks before the mind has words for it." Bessel van der Kolk a psychiatrist and trauma researcher who spent decades studying how the body holds what the mind cannot process, demonstrated through careful research that traumatic and stressful experience is encoded in the body before it is encoded in memory. The nervous system responds to perceived threat faster than conscious thought can form. The implication for ordinary anxiety, not just clinical trauma, but the low-grade anxiety of a demanding modern life, is significant. The caffeine-saturated, overstimulated, comparison-saturated, persona-exhausted person who arrives at bedtime and cannot sleep is not simply thinking anxious thoughts. Their body has been in a low-level stress response for hours, possibly all day, and the mind's anxious thoughts, rather than being the cause of the sleeplessness, are the cognitive translation of what the body has already been doing. Let your shoulders drop, really. Not as a gesture, but as a permission. You do not have to hold yourself in shape right now. The connection between the caffeinated, stimulated, overworked body and the anxious nighttime mind is direct. The nervous system, kept in a state of low-level arousal throughout the day, through coffee, through comparison, through unfinished conflict, through the blue light of constant screens, arrives at bedtime asking for downregulation. But the transition from arousal to rest does not happen instantly. The body needs a bridge. It needs signals that the day is over, that the threat detection mode can ease, that the vigilance can lower. When we do not provide those signals, when we go from screen to dark room in a matter of seconds, the body does not know it is safe. And an uncertain nervous system is a restless one. This is not a weakness. It is physiology. And physiology, like the unconscious, responds not to demand, but to invitation. What the body needs at night is an invitation to relax, not a command. Not the frustration of someone who cannot understand why they are still awake. Frustration is itself a stress signal. It makes the problem worse. The invitation is gentle. It is the willingness to slow the breath slightly, to let the jaw go, to stop demanding that the mind perform silence and instead simply create the conditions in which silence becomes possible. This is part of what we will practice later in this conversation. For now, just hold lightly the understanding that the body and the anxious mind are not two separate systems. They are one conversation. And the body started talking long before you noticed. The body-mind relationship is not a hierarchy. It is a conversation. And like most conversations that have been one-sided for a long time, it requires a period of genuine listening before balance is restored. Here is something that many people find helpful once they understand it. The body's stress signals, the tight jaw, the held breath, the shoulders lifted toward the ears, are not signs that something is going wrong. They are communications. The body is reporting on the state of the psyche. It is showing you, in the only language immediately available to it, what the mind has been experiencing and has not yet processed. When you begin to listen to these signals rather than override them, they change. Not immediately, not all at once, but measurably. The jaw that softens is not just a physical event. It is the body receiving the message that the vigilance can ease, that the performance is over for tonight, that it is safe to not be braced. Van der Kolk documented this carefully in his work with people carrying far heavier burdens than ordinary daily stress. But the principle extends to all of us. Safety is felt, the body before it is thought in the mind, and the body is listening right now. Let your breath be slow. Let the muscles of your face be soft. Let the space between your shoulder blades widen slightly. These are not techniques, they are permissions. The body already knows how to rest. It is only waiting for the signal that it is allowed to. And that signal comes not from doing more, but from finally, gently, stopping right here, right now. Chapter 19. The Eighth Hurt, Negative Self-Talk. The voice in your head is not neutral. Most people, when they become aware of the inner commentary that runs continuously throughout the day, are surprised by its tone. Not occasionally sharp, frequently harsh, in ways that would be unacceptable if spoken aloud to another person. You are not smart enough for this. Why did you say that? That was embarrassing. Other people manage this. What is wrong with you? You should have done more. You should have known better. You should have said something else. This is the inner critic, and it runs in most people far more constantly than they are aware. Jung understood the inner critic as a manifestation of the shadow, specifically as the internalized voice of authority figures whose judgment we have absorbed and made our own. Parents, teachers, early employers, cultural messages. The voice that tells you that you are not quite enough is almost never your own original voice. It is borrowed, assembled from other people's expectations, and it has been automated. That automation is the problem. During the day, the noise of activity can partially cover the inner critic's commentary. It runs in the background. You feel its effects in the tension in your chest when you make a mistake, in the disproportionate shame after a minor failure, in the hypervigilance that makes you anticipate disapproval before it even arrives. But you may not hear its actual words. At night, in the quiet, the words become audible. Let your breath be easy. There is nothing to evaluate right now. The research on inner dialogue has grown significantly in recent years. Ethan Kross, a psychologist at the University of Michigan, has spent years studying how people talk to themselves and what the effects are on emotional regulation, performance under stress, and well-being. He found something Jung would have recognized immediately. The content of the inner voice matters enormously, but so does the distance. People who narrate their inner experience in the first person, I feel this, I am failing, I should have known, show more emotional reactivity, more rumination, and more stress activation than people who achieve a slight psychological distance, who observe themselves rather than merging with the critical voice. He also found that one of the most effective ways to create that distance is to address yourself by name, not harshly, not with irony, but with the gentle address of someone speaking to a friend, the difference between "I am so stupid" and "Why did you do that?" and "What can you do differently?" is not merely semantic. It activates different neural pathways. It changes the body's stress response. It moves the psyche from inside the attack to slightly outside it. Jung would have called this witnessing. The capacity to observe the inner critic without being owned by it, not to silence it, not to fight it, but to see it clearly, to recognize that the voice is borrowed, that it is not truth, that it is the accumulation of other people's fears dressed as your own judgment. And from that recognition, a small but real freedom begins. Think of a moment you may have had, a moment where the critical voice spoke and you, for just an instant, caught yourself before completely believing it. Maybe you made a small mistake, wrote the wrong date in an email, said something slightly awkward in a conversation, forgot something you had meant to remember, and the inner critic arrived immediately with its assessment. In the past, you might have accepted the assessment without examination. But in this moment, something is slightly different. You notice the voice. You notice that it arrived instantly, before you had even fully processed what had happened. The verdict came before the evidence was reviewed. The judgment was sweeping where the situation was specific, and in noticing that, you have created a small but real distance. Jung understood this as the beginning of what he called psychological differentiation, the gradual process of distinguishing between what is genuinely yours and what has been absorbed from the outside world. The critical voice, with its absolute and rapid judgments, is almost always inherited. It has the tone and rhythm of something spoken to you long before you were old enough to evaluate it. A parent under pressure. A teacher who believed harshness built character. A culture that equated relentless productivity with worth. These voices entered before you, had a framework for questioning them, and they stayed. Automated, fluent, faster than conscious thought. But they are not facts. They are old instructions that were never reviewed. And in the quiet of a night where you are willing to be honest, they can be seen for what they are, not your voice, borrowed. And anything borrowed can, in time, be returned. What replaces it is simpler and quieter than the critic." End quote. It does not deliver verdicts. It asks questions. It wonders what happened and what might be learned, and what this person in the bed, in the dark, trying their best actually needs right now. That wondering is the beginning of the voice that belongs to you. Chapter 20. The inner critic grows loudest at night. Here is something you may have noticed. A small failure that barely registered at 3 in the afternoon has by midnight become evidence of a fundamental flaw in your character. The slightly awkward email, the meeting where you were not at your best, the moment you snapped at someone and felt immediately ashamed. none of these seem proportionate to the weight they carry at night. The inner critic in daylight is manageable. At night, it becomes a prosecuting attorney. There is a reason for this. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with rational evaluation, with perspective taking, with the capacity to contextualize an event against the fullness of your life, is less active in the pre-sleep state. The emotional centers of the brain are correspondingly more influential. This is not a design flaw. It is how the brain transitions from the analytical mode of waking life toward the more associative, emotional mode of dream and sleep. But the inner critic, which already works in the emotional register, becomes louder in exactly the environment where rational counter-evidence is least available. The comparison becomes more stinging. The mistake becomes more definitive. The self-judgment becomes more global. I am not just someone who made an error. I am someone who is fundamentally unable to manage this, and this. The night mind catastrophizes not because it is broken, but because the regulatory systems that keep catastrophizing in check are transitioning to a different function. Just notice the air moving. You do not have to solve anything. Jung understood the inner critic as what he called the negative anima, or negative animus, the internalized figure of the opposite sex archetype in its most critical and undermining form. When this figure takes over the inner dialogue at night, it does not limit itself to the facts. It globalizes. It reaches into the past for supporting evidence. It constructs a case, and the case is always, ultimately, the same. You are not enough, which of course no amount of evidence would prove true, because enoughness is not a conclusion you reach by accumulating achievements. It is a relationship you develop with yourself, and that relationship cannot be built at midnight, under the prosecution of the inner critic. It is built in smaller, quieter moments, in the daylight. In the ordinary minutes, when you choose to speak to yourself with a little more of the gentleness you give freely to others, there is a gentle thing that Brené Brown, who spent years researching shame and self-worth, found consistently in the people who seemed most psychologically whole. They were not the people who never made mistakes, never felt shame, never heard the critical voice. They were the people who could recognize shame when it arrived and respond to themselves with some of the compassion they would offer someone else in the same situation. Not bypassing the feeling, moving through it with company, your own company. The inner critic will still come, especially at night. This is not something that changes overnight, but the relationship with it can change. And the change begins with recognizing it for what it is, not your own honest assessment, an old borrowed voice that is real, and it is the beginning of something different. The process of developing a different relationship with the inner critic is not one of opposition. You do not silence the critic by arguing with it. Argument gives it more energy. It is good at argument. it has been practicing longer than you have. You do not silence it by shaming it. That is simply the critic criticizing itself, which generates more criticism. What works, Jung would say, is something slower and more patient. It is the development of a witnessing presence, a part of you that can observe the critic's activity without being entirely captured by it. That can hear the voice and recognize it and say quietly, "I see you, I know what you are. And I am choosing tonight not to build my understanding of myself from your assessment." This does not make the voice louder. Over time, with practice, it makes the voice's grip lighter. There is also this. The inner critic speaks loudest when you are most tired and least defended, which is, of course, exactly when you are trying to sleep. This is not a coincidence. Tiredness lowers the regulatory systems that normally provide some perspective. And in the absence of perspective, the critic's voice fills the space. Knowing this does not make the voice disappear, but it reframes its timing. When you recognize that the harsh self-assessment arriving at midnight is being amplified by exhaustion rather than by accuracy, you can begin to treat it as you would treat any thought that arrives in an altered state. Not as truth, as a signal that the system is depleted. And the appropriate response to depletion is not more self-examination. It is permission. Permission to rest, to let the verdict wait until morning, to trust that the version of you that will assess the situation after sleep will be more accurate, more fair, and more kind than the midnight prosecutor. The morning self is almost always more generous. Let the morning self do the work of assessment. Tonight, just rest. Chapter 21, The Ninth Hurt, Ignoring Your Deeper Needs. Jung made a distinction that cuts through decades of self-help language with unusual precision. He distinguished between what a person wants and what a person needs at the level of the psyche. The want is conscious, articulate, culturally legible. I want a promotion. I want this relationship to work. I want to feel better. I want to stop feeling this way at night. The need is deeper, often wordless, and not always polite in its demands. The need might be for solitude, when the life you have built is full of people. The need might be for creative expression when every hour is allocated to responsibility. The need might be for genuine rest when the persona demands constant productivity. The need might be for grief when the culture awards only forward movement. When the conscious life consistently ignores the deeper need, the psyche responds. Not dramatically, not at first. It responds the way a deprived plant responds. Gradually, without spectacle, just a slow withdrawal of vitality, a dulling of engagement, a flatness that arrives in the place where meaning used to live. This is not depression necessarily. though it can become that. It is what Jung described as the symptom of a life lived too far from the self. Let the weight of your body settle. There is nothing to chase right now. Think of a woman who has spent 15 years in a career that does not frighten her or bore her exactly. It is simply not her. It fits well enough, it pays, it commands respect. The persona is comfortable in it. But somewhere beneath the persona, something knows. A different set of words wants to be written. A different kind of conversation wants to be had. A different quality of attention wants to be given to things she cannot even name. She does not ignore these signals out of laziness. She ignores them because the world has given her no framework for taking them seriously. Dreams in the modern world are either grand and visible or they are irresponsible. The quiet, persistent call of something unnameable that does not fit either category. And so it goes unaddressed. And at night, the unaddressed need does not simply wait. It aches. Not loudly. In the way a door that is never opened aches. In the way a path that is never walked grows quietly over. Jung believed that the second half of life, and many people in our listening world tonight are in or approaching that second half, is meant to be an inward journey. A gradual reorientation from the outward achieving of the first half toward the inward deepening of the second. This is not a retreat from life. It is an intensification of it. But it requires attending to what is actually needed, not what is demanded, not what earns approval, not what the persona can sustain, what the self beneath all of that is quietly asking for. The ninth hurt is ignoring that asking, and the consequence arrives most clearly at night when there is nothing to distract from the voice that has been patient for years. It says, "I am still here. I have not stopped being what I am." And I would like, before we run out of time, to be heard. Chapter 22, The Cost of Self-Betrayal. The phrase sounds dramatic. Self-betrayal. It calls up images of grand moral failure, of someone who abandoned their values in a moment of weakness. But the self-betrayal Jung was pointing toward is quieter than that. It is the accumulated cost of small decisions made repeatedly to override the inner life in favor of the outer requirement. The cost is this: a gradual estrangement from your own experience. You begin to lose fluency in what you actually feel as distinct from what you are supposed to feel. You begin to lose confidence in your own instincts because you have been overriding them for so long. You begin to live in a kind of temporal exile, perpetually oriented toward the next thing, the next task, the next performance, with very little contact with the present interior moment. And at night, when there is no next thing, this exile becomes visible. The restlessness of the sleep-deprived mind is often not the noise of anxiety. It is the sound of a self that has been waiting for someone to show up. That someone is you. There are two kinds of tiredness. We have been circling this observation since the beginning of tonight. Now we can name both of them precisely. The first kind is physical. It is the tiredness of a body that has worked and needs recovery. Sleep resolves it. You lie down, you rest, you rise restored. The second kind is psychic. It is the tiredness of a self that has been performing without being nourished. Sleep helps, but it does not resolve this, because the problem is not in the sleep, it is in the waking hours. The second kind of tiredness is the tiredness of self-betrayal, of the accumulated weight of ignoring what you need, suppressing what you feel, filling what should be still, comparing yourself to images that have no relation to your actual worth, living in a persona that has gradually grown too tight. Sleep cannot fix this, not because sleep is inadequate, but because the wound is not in the night, it is in the day. Let the breath come easily. You are noticing something real. The recognition of the second kind of tiredness is not a cause for despair. It is, in Jung's framework, a form of psychological maturity, the beginning of the inward turn. The moment when a person stops asking, "What is wrong with me for feeling this way?" and begins asking, "What is this feeling asking of me?" those are very different questions. The first assumes the problem is a flaw. The second assumes the problem is a message. And messages, unlike flaws, can be received. You do not have to receive everything tonight, but you can begin. You can let the tiredness be what it is without rushing to fix it. You can let the cost of the small self-betrayals be acknowledged without shame. You can let the self that has been waiting know that you are, at least in this moment, paying attention. That is not nothing. That is, in the Jungian framework, the beginning of something very real. The work of becoming more fully yourself begins not in grand gesture, but in small acknowledgement, in the quiet. Just like this, we have been circling the two kinds of power. Tiredness since the very beginning of tonight. Now we can name them fully. The first kind you know. The body asks for rest, and rest restores it. You lie down, the muscles release, the systems slow, and in the morning something has been returned. The physical fatigue of a body that has worked and needs recovery. This kind of tiredness sleep can fix. The second kind is different in every dimension. It is not in the muscles, it is in the self, in the part of you that has been performing rather than living, suppressing rather than feeling, comparing rather than inhabiting. The part that has been running the approval check all day and the inner critic inventory all night, that has been filling the quiet before it could speak and pretending fine when something more honest was true. This tiredness accumulates across years, not hours. It is not fixed by a good night's sleep, though sleep helps, because it is the only window where some genuine processing can occur. It is fixed by a different kind of attention, by turning toward the inner life rather than away from it, by acknowledging the shadow rather than suppressing it, by letting the quiet be quiet rather than filling it immediately, by developing slowly and without perfectionism the relationship with yourself that makes the interior world feel less like a threat and more like the resource it has always been. The second kind of tiredness is the signal, not the problem, the signal. It says you have been living outward for a long time. The inward life is calling, and you are, tonight, already beginning to answer. Chapter 23. The 10th hurt, pretending you are fine. There is a small two-word phrase that gets spoken more often than almost any other in the English language. I'm fine, said in offices and at family dinners, said in response to genuine inquiry and to polite social convention, said when it is true, and far more often than most people acknowledge when it is not. Pretending you are fine is not lying. It is, in most cases, a learned social skill. The world moves faster when everyone is managing their inner life privately. Meetings run better when the participants are not processing their grief. Dinners are more pleasant when the underlying tensions are held in check. This is real. There are appropriate contexts for composure. The persona serves a genuine function. The hurt is not in the composure itself. The hurt is in what happens when the composure becomes the only available mode. When there is no moment in the day, not even at home, not even alone, when the actual truth is acknowledged, even to yourself, even in silence. When I'm fine has been said so many times, for so long, that the person saying it has partially lost access to the more honest answer. Jung was direct about this dynamic. He observed that the repression of genuine emotional truth does not neutralize it, it charges it. The feeling, denied expression, accumulates energy, and that charged energy must go somewhere. It finds expression in bodily symptoms, in displaced irritability, in the dreams that arrive with unusual urgency. It finds expression most reliably in the quiet hours when the pretending can no longer be sustained. At night, alone, in the dark, you cannot maintain the performance. And the honest answer to, "Are you fine?" finally gets to be heard. Not always in words, sometimes just as a tightness, a weight, an unnamed disquiet. But it is there, and it has been waiting. Just let the body be still. You do not need to perform anything in this room. Think of a person who has been, by all external measures, genuinely doing well, holding things together, managing the responsibilities, showing up for the people who need them, getting through the days with dignity and efficiency, and never, not once in recent memory, has said to another person, "I am struggling." Not because nothing is difficult, because the identity of being fine has become load-bearing. because admitting difficulty would require a kind of vulnerability that feels unsafe or selfish or like an imposition. And so the difficulty lives only in the night, and the night mind carries it alone. This is the 10th hurt, and it is in some ways the one that holds all the others together. Because when you cannot admit, even to yourself, that something is hard, the other 9 habits grow. The scrolling increases because the feeling needs distraction. The comparison deepens because the gap between the performed fine and the interior reality creates its own anxiety. The suppression intensifies because the honest feeling has nowhere else to go. Pretending you are fine is not a character weakness. It is usually the sign of someone who learned very early that their inner life was not entirely welcome. That is a wound worth acknowledging, not to stay in it. Not to let it define you, but to recognize it for what it is, because in recognition is the first real freedom. Think of what a night might feel like if it began differently, not with the performance maintained until the last second, then abruptly dropped in the dark, but with a small, private moment of honesty somewhere in the evening, not shared with anyone necessarily, just acknowledged to yourself. Today was harder than I let on, or I am carrying something I have not named yet, or most simply, I am not entirely fine. The acknowledgement does not need to be large. It does not require action or expression or sharing. It is simply the interior truth being permitted to exist. Jung described the psyche as self-regulating. When the conscious mind acknowledges a difficult reality, the unconscious does not need to amplify it to force recognition. The nightly eruption of suppressed material, the 3 a.m. anxiety, the inexplicable sadness, the circular thoughts is in part the unconscious doing what consciousness has refused to do. When consciousness does its part, the unconscious can rest. When you can say, even silently, even in the dark of the mind, I am carrying this, the pressure below the surface eases slightly, not because the problem is solved, because it has been acknowledged. The part of you that needed to be seen has been seen, even if only by yourself. And the self, it turns out, is the only witness that ultimately matters. The people who cannot sleep are often not the ones in the most difficult circumstances. They are the ones who have been most rigorous in denying those circumstances to themselves. The most durable sleepers tend to be people who have developed a practice of interior honesty that does not require perfect circumstances. They can hold both things. This is hard, and I will be all right. Both true. Not resolved, just held. That holding is not passivity. It is a form of profound psychological strength. And it begins with the willingness to stop pretending, at least to yourself, that everything is fine when it is not. That one small honesty, practiced regularly, changes the quality of the night more than most sleep techniques do, because it changes the quality of the relationship between the day self and the night self. And that relationship is what the night is always asking you to tend. Chapter 24. The Mask That Disturbs Sleep. There is a moment in the transition towards sleep when the mask loses its grip. The persona, the face we turn to the world, the version of ourselves we have spent all day maintaining, cannot follow us all the way into sleep. At some point in the drift toward unconsciousness, the performance ceases. The monitoring relaxes. The held version of yourself begins to dissolve. For some people, this is the most frightening part of trying to sleep, because what waits on the other side of the mask's loosening is the unguarded self. And the unguarded self may have things to say that the managed day never allowed. Jung described this in his concept of what he called the shadow's nocturnal activity. During sleep, the unconscious, including the shadow, has direct access to consciousness through dreaming. The material that was suppressed, managed, and denied during the day rises in dream imagery, in the quality of pre-sleep thought, in the hypnagogic images that appear on the edge of sleep. The person who has spent the day performing fine will often have the most vivid transition to sleep. Not vivid in a pleasant sense, necessarily. Vivid in the sense of full, restless, image-rich, resistant to true rest. Because the mask, as it loosens, releases what it was holding. And what it was holding is the accumulated truth of the day. The feelings not felt, the conversations not had, the needs not met, the honest assessments not made. All of it waiting. Let your jaw be soft. Let the next breath arrive without effort. Here is what Jung observed, and what you may recognize as true. The mask is not the enemy. The mask made it possible to get through the day. The mask served you. In many hours and many situations, it protected you and others from more than was necessary or kind to share. The problem is not that the mask exists. The problem is that it has no off switch. Most people wear the persona from the moment they wake until the moment they fall asleep. There is no transition, no ceremony of removal, no moment of acknowledged difference between the social self and the private one. And when the unconscious finally removes the mask during sleep transition, it does so without warning, which is experienced not as relief, but as exposure. The anxious spiral before sleep is often this: the sudden absence of the managing self and the eruption of what the managing self was managing. Without preparation, without gentleness, without any prior acknowledgement that what lies beneath the mask is acceptable, this is the mask that disturbs. Sleep. Not because you are doing something wrong, because the persona was never designed to function without pause. Because the psyche was never built to suppress its real content indefinitely without consequence. The consequence is the restless night, and the answer is not to abandon the mask, it is to develop a gentle relationship with the face beneath it, to let the honest self have at least a little territory, even if only in the quiet, even if only in the hours before sleep, even if only here in this conversation right now. Chapter 25. Why ordinary habits become night suffering. We have now named all 10 of the hurts: the scrolling, the comparing, the suppressing, the approval-seeking, the unfinished conversations, the filling of quiet, the caffeine, the negative self-talk, the ignored deeper needs, the pretending. None of them are dramatic. None of them, encountered in isolation, would qualify as a crisis. A person who occasionally scrolls before bed is not in danger. A person who sometimes seeks approval is navigating the world the way most people do. A person who sometimes ignores what they need is busy and human and doing their best. The hurt is not in any single habit. The hurt is in their accumulation, in the fact that they are not occasional but structural. Not exceptions, but the daily pattern. Not conscious choices, but automatic behaviors that have been operating for years beneath the threshold of deliberate attention. And beneath the threshold is precisely where Jung was most interested. The night does not create the noise. We established that early in this conversation, and now we can understand it fully. The night removes the cover. The noise was always there. Built across the day through 10 ordinary habits that are each in isolation, understandable, and together form a system that keeps the inner life continuously at bay. The reason ordinary habits become night suffering is both simple and profound. The day provides cover. The busyness, the stimulation, the social engagement, the noise, all of it gives the inner life nowhere to be heard. And the inner life, as Jung demonstrated across a lifetime of clinical work, does not disappear because it has no outlet. It waits for one, and the outlet every night is the same: the quiet. Let your body be heavy, let the breath slow. There is nothing required of you now. Jung wrote toward the end of his long life that the meeting with oneself is one of the most unpleasant things that can be avoided and one of the most necessary things that must eventually be faced. He meant this with great compassion. He had been there himself. The years after his break with Freud, when he sat with his own inner material in a study late at night, documenting what frightened him, making contact with what he had professionally bypassed, he understood that the encounter is not comfortable. He also understood that it is not destructive. What is destructive is the avoidance. The decades of fine, the years of filling. The habits that serve, one day at a time, to prevent the inner voice from completing a sentence. Because a voice prevented from completing its sentence does not grow quiet, it grows louder. And the nightly suffering is the loudness, not punishment, not pathology, just the natural pressure of a psyche seeking what every psyche ultimately seeks: contact with itself. Tonight, you are making that contact. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. And that is already something different. Chapter 26, Trauma Hidden in Daily Routine. There is a version of wounding that does not qualify as trauma in the clinical sense. It did not arrive in a single event. It did not produce the recognizable symptoms that researchers measure and chart. It did not come from violence or catastrophe or loss so sudden it could not be integrated. It came slowly, through years of being in environments where your feelings were not welcome, through decades of relationships where being strong was required and being vulnerable was costly, through the accumulated experience of a life in which the inner world was consistently treated as secondary by others and eventually by yourself. Jung and the researchers who followed in his tradition, including the careful work of Bessel van der Kolk, who mapped how the body stores what the mind cannot process, understood that this slower, more diffuse form of wounding is not less real for being less dramatic. It is simply harder to locate, because there is no event to point to, no clear before and after. Just the gradual shaping of a person who has learned deeply and automatically to manage their interior life rather than inhabit it. This shaping lives in daily routine. In the morning, coffee consumed in 5 minutes while reading emails. In the commute, spent on a podcast rather than in thought. In the lunch break that is not a break. In the evening that never quite arrives at rest. In the bedtime that comes not when the body is ready, but when the day has finally exhausted its demands. In the small, daily habits of a person who has learned to be useful and present and managed, and not quite to themselves. Let the stillness be with you for a moment. There is nothing to analyze here, just a recognition. The routine is not the problem. Many daily rituals are genuinely sustaining. But when the routine exists primarily to maintain the outer performance and never to restore the inner self, it accumulates its own kind of wound. The person who arrives at bedtime with the 10 habits in full effect is not weak. They are the product of a very ordinary, very common form of shaping. A culture that rewards productivity over interiority. A relational history that valued composure over honesty. A working world that mistook busyness for meaning. All of it understandable, all of it costly, and all of it healable. Not in one night. Not through a technique or a program or a set of daily practices that can be optimized, but through the slow, patient work of paying attention, of letting the inner world have a little more space each day, of recognizing the habits when they arise, not with self-condemnation, but with simple awareness. There is something here that I have been avoiding. That one sentence, spoken inwardly and honestly, is more therapeutic than any amount of accumulated psychology, because it is contact. And contact with yourself, with your own truth, with the life that is actually happening rather than the one you are managing, is what the psyche has been asking for. In every restless night, in every morning that arrives, without true restoration, in every quiet moment you filled before it could tell you something real, let the stillness hold you. There is no performance required here. Now, consider this. The wound that lives in daily routine is not inaccessible. It is, in a very real sense, the most accessible wound there is, because it is embedded in the ordinary. It does not require a dramatic catalyst to reach. It is woven into the Tuesday morning and the Thursday commute and the Sunday that should have been restful and was not quite. And this means the healing is equally accessible. It is in the ordinary, in the small. Decision to sit for 5 minutes without filling the silence. In the moment of noticing a feeling before covering it over. In the single honest sentence said to yourself in the quiet before sleep. This was harder than I let on today. These are not dramatic interventions. They are the daily renegotiation of a relationship with yourself. And that renegotiation, practiced across days and weeks, begins to dissolve the accumulated wound in the same way it was created, gradually, without spectacle, through the quiet authority of consistent, gentle honesty. Van der Kolk found in his research that healing from embedded wounding is not a single event, it is a direction, a consistent reorientation toward safety, toward the body's signals, toward the honest interior reality rather than the managed exterior performance. That direction is available to you tonight. Not through anything dramatic, through the simplest possible act. Choosing to be where you are in this body, in this quiet, in this actual moment, rather than everywhere else the mind has been invited to go. There is a version of this that may be familiar to you. You are somewhere in your 50s, perhaps a few years past it, and the life you have built is, in its structure, exactly what you set out to build. The work is there, the family is there, the stability is there, but something has started to shift in recent years. A faint rearrangement of priorities. A growing sense that the things you spent the most energy on are not necessarily the things that feel most alive. Not regret, exactly. Not dissatisfaction, exactly. More like a question becoming louder. Is this what I actually want? Or is this what I assembled from the raw material of other people's expectations and my own younger self's ambitions? And beneath that question, what do I want now? Not at 30, now. This is what Jung was describing when he spoke about the second half of life as an inward journey. Not abandoning what was built, but beginning to ask with honest curiosity what the inner self has been waiting to say while the outer life was under construction. The deeper need is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the need for one afternoon a week of solitude, for a creative practice that has no audience, for a friendship that requires nothing of the persona, for a relationship with oneself that is not mediated by productivity or approval. These are not luxury needs. In the Jungian framework, they are the needs of a psyche that is trying to stay whole across a life that has largely prioritized the outer half. And when they go unmet, the night is where their absence speaks most clearly, not as complaint, as longing. And longing, honestly acknowledged, is already a form of direction. It tells you where the life wants to go when it is finally allowed to say so. Chapter 27. Reclaiming Mental Clarity. Let us be clear about what reclaiming means. It does not mean returning to a prior state of perfect calm. It does not mean achieving a mind that never circles or worries or wakes at 3 a.m. It does not mean the elimination of difficulty. Reclaiming mental clarity, in the Jungian sense, means developing a functional relationship with your own interior life. It means the ability to feel what you feel, including the difficult feelings, without being entirely at their mercy. It means recognizing the inner critic as a borrowed voice rather than a final judgment. It means becoming, gradually, someone who can sit in silence without immediately fleeing. It means letting the mask down in at least one corner of your life, even if only in the quiet of your own private hours, and meeting what is there, with something other than suppression. These are not dramatic achievements, they are quiet ones, and they accumulate the same way the hurts accumulate, gradually across ordinary days, in the 10,000 small choices that make up a life. Jung's individuation is not a destination, it is a direction. The direction of becoming more fully yourself, more integrated, more in contact with the whole of who you are rather than only the approved portion. And it begins not with the transformation, but with a turn, a small, interior turn toward the self, which you can begin practicing right now, tonight, in the simplest possible way. Let the breath be easy. For a moment, set aside every role you occupy, every name you are called by others, every function you serve, and every task you maintain, not permanently, just for this breath. And notice what remains when those layers are set aside. Something is still here, something that has been here throughout all of it. Through the busyness and the comparing and the persona and the years of being fine. This is what Jung spent his life pointing toward. Not a technique, not a philosophical system, though the philosophy is rich and worth exploring. A simple, foundational, completely overlooked fact. You are here, not the performance of you, not the managed version of you in the actual. unscripted reality of this moment. And this you, the one underneath everything else, is not broken. It is not inadequate. It is not the sum of its worst habits or its most difficult nights. It is, in the fullest sense of the word, real, and beginning to reclaim mental clarity starts there, not in the habits, though the habits matter, not in the techniques, though we will explore some of those, but in this foundational recognition: something true is here, and it was always here. And the night, for all its restlessness, is also always and only this: the place where something true gets a little more room. Here is a practical truth that is worth landing before we move into the final chapters. Reclaiming mental clarity is not the same as achieving a quiet mind. The quiet mind is a pleasant side effect of the real work. The real work is the relationship, the ongoing, imperfect, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately sustaining relationship between the conscious self and the unconscious one, between the persona and the deeper self, between who you present yourself as being and who you actually are. When that relationship is functioning well, when there is genuine communication rather than suppression, when the inner life is acknowledged in the day rather than erupting in the night, the mind quiets naturally. Not because the problems have been solved, because the psyche is no longer working against itself. The energy that was used in suppression is freed. The charge that accumulated behind the held feelings discharges. The circular thoughts that were not thoughts at all, but feelings in disguise, finally reveal their actual nature and, once felt, release. This is what genuine rest looks like in the Jungian framework. Not the absence of inner life, the presence of a self that is at peace with its own interior. That peace is not far from you. It is, in fact, exactly where you are sitting right now, in the quiet with the inner world. Listening, that is all it ever asked of you, and you are doing it. Something in the doing of it has already changed. You may not feel it yet with full clarity, but the psyche registered it. The inner self noted the attention, and that noting is never wasted, not even in sleep, not even in forgetting. It compounds quietly in the direction of wholeness. Chapter 28. Small changes. Deeper peace. We have spent a long time in the territory of understanding. Now, let us spend a little time in the territory of practice, not technique in the demanding sense, not another system to optimize or a program to maintain perfectly, just small, specific, Jungian-informed adjustments that, practiced with gentleness, begin to shift the relationship between the day self and the night self. The first is the simplest. Give the transition 20 minutes between the last screen and the bedroom, 20 minutes of no input, not silence enforced through gritted teeth, just the ordinary quiet of a body moving through its own home, making tea, sitting briefly in the dark, doing the things that need doing without the background noise. Those 20 minutes create the buffer that the psyche needs to begin its own sorting work. The images and feelings of the day begin to settle. The analytical mind, denied new input, begins to soften. The softer awareness that precedes sleep begins to rise. You cannot force the transition, but you can create the conditions for it. The second small change is related to the inner critic. When the critical voice speaks at night, and it will, because this is not solved in an evening, try something specific. Do not argue with it. Do not try to reason it into silence. Instead, briefly name it. There is the voice. Not my voice. Not the truth, the voice. That simple naming creates the distance that Ethan Kross's research found so effective. The movement from inside the attack to slightly outside it. The witnessing position. The voice may continue, but your relationship with it will be slightly different. And slightly different, practiced across many nights, becomes something meaningful. The third small change is the acknowledgement. At some point in the evening, not necessarily journaling, not necessarily anything formal, allow a moment of honest interior accounting. What actually happened in me today? Not what I did, what I felt, what I needed, what I suppressed, what I am carrying. Not for long, not with drama, just a moment of letting the inner life be real before the night requires that it be loud. Think of it as a small ceremony of honesty, a brief acknowledgement before the dark. Let your shoulders drop, let the next breath be slower. Jung's practice of what he called active imagination was, at its root, a practice of dialogue with the inner life, not passively observing it, actually conversing with it, asking the image, or feeling what it needs, letting it answer in its own language. Most people will not practice formal active imagination, but the principle lives in something simpler. The question, what do I actually need right now? Not what I should do, not what would be productive, not what the persona would choose. What do I need? Asked genuinely, listened to honestly. That question, practiced as a small daily ritual, begins to rebuild the relationship between the conscious self and the deeper self, gradually, without fanfare. In the quiet moments that exist in every life if we choose to use them, these are small changes. They will not resolve everything in a night or a week or a month, but they are real. They are grounded in the best psychological understanding we have of how the inner life works. And they are, in the truest sense, a beginning. Chapter 29. Letting the mind grow quiet. Let us pause here for a moment. Not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. You have been listening for a while now. Some of what you heard has landed, some of it has drifted past. Some of it may have touched something you have been carrying for a long time. All of that is welcome. Right now, your body is holding you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. There is nothing to change. Just notice. Now let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it deeper or slower. Just let it move the way it wants to move. If your mind is busy, that is fine. The mind has been full tonight. That is expected. That is honest. You do not need to quiet it. Just let it be busy in the background, like a sound from another room that is there but no longer demands your full attention. Think of the thought that has been circling most persistently tonight. Not the loudest one, if there are several. The one that keeps returning. The one that waits for you when everything else goes still. Now, instead of engaging with it directly, instead of solving it, arguing with it, or pushing it away, try something different. Just see it. Imagine placing that thought on a shelf on the far side of the room. It is still there. You have not erased it. You have not pretended it does not exist, but you are here and it is over there. Notice the distance. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who can observe them, and the one who is watching, that part of you, has always been calmer than the thoughts themselves. That part has been calm even on the hardest nights. Even in the worst of the 3 a.m. spirals, even in the deepest of the persona exhaustion, something in you was watching and had not been swept away. That is the witness Jung was pointing toward. Not a special state, not something you have to earn or achieve, just the ordinary awareness that notices your own experience without being entirely lost in it. Take one slow breath and let that thought stay on the shelf for now. It will be there tomorrow if you need it. The feelings it carries will be there. The situation it points toward will be there. But tonight, you do not have to hold it. Tonight, the holding is over. The 10 hertz have been seen, not fixed. The work of fixing is the work of days and years, but seen, named, given the acknowledgement that they have been quietly asking for through every restless night, and with acknowledgement, something always shifts, not dramatically. The way ice shifts in early spring, the way a held breath finally releases. The way a door left ajar is not the same as a door locked shut. The mind grows quiet not because the problems disappear. It grows quiet because the self has been heard. You have been heard tonight. And the night from here is different. Let the next 7 days be a small and gentle practice. Day 1. Notice one inner signal. Today, just notice one moment when a feeling arrives and you move immediately to cover it. Not to stop yourself from covering it, not to force yourself to feel it fully, just to notice the movement. To catch for 1 second the thing that was there before the cover went on. That 1 second of awareness is enough for day 1. That is all. Just that. Day 2. 2 minutes without noise. At some point today, allow 2 minutes of genuine quiet. Not meditation, not silence as a discipline. Just turn off the background for 2 minutes. The podcast in the car, the television that no one is watching, the radio in the kitchen, 2 minutes. Notice what arises in the space. You do not have to do anything with what arises. Just let it be there. Day 3, name 1 borrowed voice. Today, when the inner critic speaks, try to hear it not as your own voice, but as someone else's. Not to assign blame, just to recognize the borrowing. You might think, that sounds like something I was told when I was young. Or that is the voice of a standard I absorbed, not one I chose. Notice the voice is not original. That noticing is the beginning of choosing something different. Day 4. Ask 1 honest question. In the evening today, ask yourself 1 honest question. What did I actually feel today? Not what I managed, not what I performed, what I felt. Let the answer be simple, 1 word, even, tired, frustrated, unexpectedly happy for a moment, quietly sad, relieved. Name it. That is enough. Day 5. Give the persona a rest. Choose 1 context today where you allow yourself to be slightly less managed. Not with someone who requires the full performance. Choose a safe context, a walk alone, a conversation with someone who knows you well, a moment of sitting in your car before going inside. In that context, say something honest. Something slightly more honest than usual. You do not have to share your whole interior life. Just 1 more true thing than you would normally say. Notice what happens in your body when you do. Day 6. Sit with what has been waiting. In the quiet of this evening, let yourself think about the deeper need. Not the wants, those are clear. The need, the thing beneath the want that has not been getting enough room. More solitude, perhaps. Or more creativity. Or more genuine connection. Or more honesty. Or more rest. Or permission to grieve something you have been moving too quickly past. Name the need, even silently. You do not have to act on it tonight. Just give it the dignity of being named. It has been waiting a long time to be heard. Day 7. Return to the inner self tonight. Before sleep, lie in silence for 2 minutes. No phone. No audio. No plan for what to think about. Just you and the dark. Let whatever comes, come. If the mind is busy, let it be busy. If the body is restless, let it be restless. But underneath the busyness and the restlessness, something is there. Something that was there before the day started and will be there after it ends. something that has been there through every version of you that you have inhabited across all the years. Jung called it the self, the whole and original self, beneath the persona and the shadow and the complexes and the masks. You do not have to name it, you only have to let it be present. 2 minutes, and then sleep. Chapter 30. Returning to the inner self. We began tonight in a room that was quiet. The lights were low. The phone was face down. The day had officially ended, and something followed you under the covers. A residue, a hum, the low, persistent sense that the mind was not ready to rest. We have spent these hours looking at that hum, not to silence it by force, not to diagnose it or categorize it or add it to a list of things to fix, but to understand what it is made of. The 10 ordinary habits, the 10 quiet hurts, none of them dramatic, each of them real. And beneath all of them, the same simple truth that Jung spent a lifetime trying to articulate in every language he knew. The inner life does not disappear because the outer life is busy. It waits. It speaks in the language of the sleepless hour, in the anxious thought without origin, in the feeling that has no specific address. It waits for the quiet to say what the day would not allow. And tonight, it was allowed. Something in you was patient. Something in you was watching. Something in you remained calm and witnessing even when the thoughts were loudest, even when the persona was most exhausting, even when the borrowed critical voice was most insistent. That something is not a technique. It cannot be purchased or scheduled or optimized. It is simply what you are beneath everything else. Jung called it the self, the totality, the wholeness that was never broken, only temporarily obscured. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. We named it tonight, the second kind, the tiredness of the psyche that has been performing without being nourished. And sleep cannot fix it, but this can begin to. Not the psychology, not the understanding, though understanding matters. This, the small interior turn, the moment of acknowledging what is actually present. The choice to let the inner life have a little more room. That turn has been happening tonight, without effort, without drama, simply by being willing to sit in the quiet long enough to hear something real. Let your shoulders be soft. Let your breath find its own pace. The 10 hertz will still be there tomorrow. The habits will return. The persona will be needed. The comparisons will arrive. The inner critic will speak. All of that is true. And also true is this. You came here tonight. You chose something slow and honest over something fast and distracting. You let the voice of someone who has thought carefully about these things accompany you through the dark. That is not nothing. That is the beginning of a different kind of relationship with yourself. Jung once sat alone in his study in the small hours, with a manuscript that no one would see for 50 years, in conversation with the parts of himself that frightened him. And he found, on the other side of that conversation, not the fragmentation he feared, but a deeper wholeness than he had known before. The inner journey is not a fall, it is a return to what was always there beneath the accumulated habits and the borrowed voices and the decade-long performances. The face beneath the mask, the current beneath the surface, the self that has been patient and is patient still. You do not have to find it tonight. You do not have to arrive anywhere by morning. You only have to let this moment be what it is. Quiet, real, yours. The room is still. You are here. The mind, having been heard, begins at last to ease. Let the night hold you now. You have done enough. Sleep now.